Hey guys, it's John here. So just by the fact that you clicked on this video, I already know something about you. You are a student who is about to take the SAT very soon, and for whatever reason, you just cannot understand reading questions on the test. It may be one specific question type like vocab or passage questions, or it could be just the entire section as a whole and every single problem type within those. Both of those are completely fair. And for whatever reason, no matter how many practice problems you do, your score is just not improving in the reading section. You can't figure out how to do these problems, and it just feels like something is either wrong with you or something is really wrong with your strategy. In this video, I'm going to explain every single major question type in reading and writing, how to do it, and all of the different things you need to know, plus practice questions for every single one. That is vocab, passage questions, grammar, transitions, student notes. All of those are going to be covered in this video. The goal is to make this video one where, yes, it might be long, but any student who actually watches through this and understands everything and actually takes notes and tries the practice problems I show is going to have, honestly, an unfair advantage compared to all of the other students taking the reading section of the SAT when it comes to test day. And the best part about this video is I'm also trying to design it to be basically plug and play. You can watch this video even the night before the SAT or a few days before and still get some really valuable knowledge that will actually make material improvements when you do take the SAT. I'm not guaranteeing that you're going to get like a 1500 or something, but I will say your score will be better as a result of watching this video and actually understanding it than if you did not do so. At least I think it would. That's not a 100% guarantee, but I genuinely think that would be the case. If you want to know why you can trust me, I've personally scored a 1550 on the SAT with a 760 in the reading and writing section. I currently own this, which is the largest SAT community on this website called Skool. There are multiple different SAT communities on this website, but we are the biggest and most active one on there. I'm also having it as my goal to make the YouTube channel you're watching right now the best SAT channel on the YouTube platform, which I think is a pretty good goal. So if you are very new to reading and writing on the SAT, you should just know that on the reading and writing section, it is split into two separate modules, Module 1 and then Module 2. And in each module, you have these different question types in this exact order, 27 questions, and these are the different types shown. I'm going to try to connect every single thing I say in this video to this exact thing here. Starting with the first, vocab. This is going to be about maybe the first 5 questions you'll see in every reading and writing module on the test, and here's everything you need to know for that. In this video, I'm going to explain the exact strategy for how to do any SAT vocab question, no matter how difficult it is, and even if you don't know what the words actually mean. I'm going to say some stuff in this video that I genuinely have not heard any other SAT YouTuber talk about, or at least explain in this way. So stay locked in and focus, because you might actually learn something that will change your entire strategy in this video. Let me start by showing you what most students do. And let me tell you, this is going to look really cringe, but a lot of you guys are doing it. When you see a vocab question, what most students end up doing is they might just like skim through the passage. Like, okay, researchers said the reefs and they consider exceptional out of their frequency. So they, I guess they feel more confident or something about their stuff. Okay, so that makes sense to me. And now let me look at the choices. Renew, okay, I know what that word means. So that's probably going to be the right answer, I assume. Temper, I do not know what that word means, so probably is not going to be it. Celebrate, okay, that sounds good, but it sounds a little bit too happy, so I'm not going to go for that one. Then dismiss, not really sure if I know what that word means either, so yeah, probably not going to go for it. Okay, so I'll just go for renew for the answer. You can probably see as I did that was an extremely cringe, really bad way of approaching this. No kind of actual strategy, no kind of system, and I went for renew, which is not even the right answer for this one. Instead, you want to be approaching these questions very systematically. Let me show you the exact process. First thing you do is you read through the passage. And I explained this a little bit more in my reading passage video. Definitely check that out. That was like a really good video. Honestly, like unironically, I'm pretty happy with how that video turned out. But essentially, just to summarize what I say in that video, you want to basically read each sentence and explain it in your own mind or out loud if you're in private as you go through it, just to make sure you fully understand it. Basically pretend like you're explaining it to somebody who has the same amount of skills, same amount of knowledge, just as smart as you are, and you just want to explain it to that person. And by doing this, you end up really understanding each sentence well in your own mind, and it helps you be able to make a really good choice for the answer. So for this one here, we see researchers studying coral reefs in the Pacific have found that bleaching events, once considered exceptional, now occur with enough frequency that some scientists have begun to blank their earlier optimism. Okay, so just to summarize that, before I even finish the sentence, what we're saying here is that researchers who are studying these reefs, they found that, I guess, whitening events, that are the things where they make them more white, I guess that's like a common thing for coral. They were once considered like something that almost never happens, like it's a very rare thing, but now they're very common, so they're happening like all the time. And so for that reason, let me read the rest of it, they've begun to blank their earlier optimism about the reef's long-term resilience. Okay, so I would assume they used to feel really, really confident. They used to think like, okay, this never happened, so the reefs must be awesome. And now they're realizing like, okay, it's actually happening all the time, so we're probably screwed. The reefs are probably going to get absolutely destroyed in like a few years. So I would assume they're beginning to decrease, they're beginning to lower their optimism essentially. And that is actually step 2 of the process, which is make a prediction. Before you even look at the choices, predict what you think the answer probably is going to be. Many students never do this, and it's one reason they consistently make the wrong choices on these questions. Because when you make a prediction, it kind of primes your brain to be able to tell the right answer. It kind of will make it jump out at you even what the correct answer is. And it'll be so much easier than if you're just going into it blind. It's very easy to confuse yourself and choose an answer that's not right at all if you're just going to the choices immediately. As for what your prediction has to be, just think of some word that comes to your mind as for what would probably fill in the blank. I said the word decrease. I think that's a fair prediction for this one. You might think of like lower, something like that. And just keep in mind, I really want to stop like kind of the cap here. If you cannot make a prediction, you did not understand the passage well enough. Like, full stop, there's not really any exception to that rule. I'm just going to say there is no exception to that rule. And the way to think about it is kind of like, if I was to explain to you something and I didn't finish the thought off, assuming you like understand the world, I'm assuming you understand like people, at least a little bit, you probably are going to be able to guess how I'm going to finish off my statement. Like, for example, say I told you, hey, I just won $1 million. You probably would guess that I'm going to finish that sentence off by saying like, hey, I'm really excited. I'm really happy. I'm going to do something amazing. Or if I'm like an entrepreneur, maybe you'd expect me to say like, hey, I'm going to invest in my business. Or if I'm someone who like really is tired with life, you might expect me to say, hey, I'm going to go to the Bahamas and like, drink coconuts all day. You would be able to make a prediction as for how I would finish that thought off. You would not be like, hey, I have no idea what you're going to say there. You're not like, have no expectations at all. Assuming you at least know me at least a little bit. And so that's the same way this works. If you cannot make a prediction, clearly you just don't understand the passage. Clearly you are not making sense of it in your mind well enough. And in that case, you should go back to the passage and reread it until you do. Just do that. Then finally, you can go and select the right answer. Now, a few things I really need to mention for this process of selecting the right answer. First of all, I kind of view it as a math equation. So it's kind of like the probability of the question choice being right is equal to how confident you are that you know what the word actually means, multiplied by how likely it is you think it's going to be right. And now just think about what this is actually saying. So if you see a word where you have no idea at all what it means, you're going to have a very, very low confidence. It doesn't matter how correct you might think it looks, your confidence is going to be very, very low. So it's probably not going to have very high probability of being right. But you might see a question where you have a very, very high confidence of it being either right or wrong. If you have a very high confidence of it being wrong, then you know that it's like a very high, you can think of this as like a negative number. It's like if there's a negative chance of it being right, it's going to be a very high thing times something negative, which would be like a large negative number, like negative 500 or something. But if it's something else, if you actually are very confident it is right, you would then have a very high confidence of it being the right answer, in which case you should probably select that answer. It's probably going to be right. Now, you can't always maximize both of these. Sometimes you'll have to go for one where it's a little bit more of one than the other. But at the very least, you can use this to think about the choices. You can use this to make a little bit more sense of it in your mind. Now, as for what you can use to figure out whether it's right, there are really 3 things. First is just vibes. Now, I know this is like very non-scientific. I know I just went on a whole like big rant about how you're supposed to use a very systematic way of solving these problems. Unfortunately, sometimes there are cases where you just have to use what the word looks like. So leave open that possibility. That can happen, unfortunately. Be okay with that. Second thing is what I call etymology. This refers to the roots and prefixes of the word. In my Skool community, I actually have a link to all of the most frequent roots and prefixes that you'll see on SAT Vocab questions, so check that out with the link in the description below. But back to the thing. Etymology refers to those kinds of things. It's like if I have a word and starts with IN. IN typically means not. Like if I was to say the word indestructible, invincible, incapable. All those mean not something, not able to be destroyed, not able to be conquered, vindicated, not able to be capable. Then using that information, you can typically find out what the rest of the word means. So etymology is a super big thing. And if you can memorize these different roots and prefixes, it makes these questions so much easier, I'll be honest. And then the third thing is just what you already know. Now, I leave this at third rather than first because I don't want you to feel that you 100% have to know what every single word means. In fact, that's like kind of a pipe dream. Like you're probably not going to be able to understand or at least know for sure what every single word means. But if you do know what a word means, then of course you can use your previous knowledge. Like you can just use what you know. So going back to this one now, let's go to each of these choices. Renew. I definitely know what renew means. I have a very high confidence on that. But I don't think it's going to be right because we're looking for something that means like decrease. Renew is basically the exact opposite of decrease. So I'm very confident that this is wrong. So A is definitely not going to be the right answer. Then we have temper. So I'll be honest, I kind of have an idea of what this means. I'm, moderately confident, I guess you could say. And as for my confidence, I believe temper means kind of like decrease or like lower or at least make it a little bit less high than the highest in terms of something. So if I was like to temper my expectations, I would essentially lower my expectations. So I'm basically saying a bunch of things here that makes it seem pretty obvious that yes, temper is going to be the right choice for you because I have a pretty decent confidence, but it's a very high likelihood of it being right. So moderate here, but very high here. So therefore B is going to be right. If we look at the other one, celebrate, I do have a very high confidence for that one, but same thing, very low chance of it actually being right because it's just celebrate, that's, again, pretty much the exact opposite of decrease, or at least kind of different kind of idea than decrease, you could say. And then finally, dismiss. I do have very high confidence on this as well. I do know what this means. It means like to get rid of something. Like if I dismiss my employee, that basically means I fire them. As for how likely I think it is that's going to be right, it's kind of like more mid because dismiss their earlier optimism about the reef's long-term resilience. We're not like throwing it away. It's more like we're just lowering it. It's not like we're completely like getting rid of all optimism we ever felt. So therefore, B is going to be the right answer. Let's go through a few more of these. Despite spending over a decade pursuing the project, the architect was forced to blank the most ambitious design after city planners rejected the proposal for the fourth time. So as for my re-explanation of the passage, I guess we're saying here, so this architect pursued this for a very, very long time, but the architect was forced to, I guess, abandon essentially the idea after they kept getting rejection again and again. They eventually had to give up on their dreams and be sad and I guess whatever. So I would guess the word like abandon and dead ass. I did not realize that was one of the choices. So, okay, I guess we're pretty confident it's going to be abandoned for the correct answer, but let's just check to make sure. So looking at these choices, refine. I do know what refine means. High confidence there. Refine her design. She would not just be refining it if she literally got rejected. Like refining something you do when you get like constructive feedback. If she got rejected, she's like throwing it out. So low probability of it being right. So get rid of that one. Abandon. Yes, it is exactly my prediction. But even if it wasn't, I could just also look at it like abandon. I definitely know what that means. And I also have a very high confidence of it being right because abandon, that means like get rid of something, get rid of your ideas, etc. Defend and publicize, I may have a strong confidence on those, but both of them just don't really seem right as well. Same kind of thing, they don't match the passage. Marie Curie was often portrayed by early biographers as a solitary genius working in isolation, but more recent historical research has blanked this characterization by uncovering the substantial network of collaborators whose work support her own. So Marie Curie, they used to think that she was just, an introvert, solitary person just working on her own, grinding in the dark, I guess you could say. But then they actually discovered that she had a bunch of collaborators that really helped her out, really made her work better. So she was more like actually working with other people. So as for my prediction, I guess I would say kind of change the characterization. It did not completely destroy it, but at least they realized, okay, she wasn't just fully like on her Sigma grinds at ARC. She had some other people that she was working with as well. So I guess I'd just say change. Now let's look at the choices. So confirm. Okay, high confidence there, but definitely not right at all because confirmed is like, yeah, that's the exact opposite of what we're going for. Revise. Okay, that seems pretty good here. High confidence here. I do know what that word means. And revise, it means like to kind of change up to make something a little bit different. So definitely going to go for this one as well. Celebrate, replicated. Same kind of issue as a high confidence, but low chance of it being right. Here's a much harder one now. Many policymakers assume that lowering taxes will automatically stimulate economic growth. So trickle-down economics type stuff, if you get lower taxes, more stuff in the economy. However, empirical studies of past tax cuts presents a far more blank picture, with outcomes that vary significantly by country, time period, and the specific tax being adjusted. So there's a lot more stuff going on. It's a lot more complicated, you could say, than what they initially expected. As for my prediction, I guess I would just say complicated. Yeah, that's a pretty fair one. That's not one of the choices here, though, so we're going to have to look a little bit more closely. So damaging. Very confident about that one, damage, to destroy something essentially. But it's not damaging, because damaging has a very negative kind of idea with it. It's like you're destroying something. It's like, in order for this to be the case, you'd have to say that the economy is completely destroyed every single time you put taxes in there. That's not really the case, so very low likelihood of this being right. Equivocal. I gotta be honest, I only have like a moderate actual like understanding of that word. I think it means something like maybe more ambiguous. I'm guessing, because I think unequivocal, it means like, full, complete destruction. But like ambiguous, I think, is kind of the idea. But as for my thought of it being right, I think probably a decent chance, but I'm not entirely sure. So I'll put like maybe like a small error, I guess I could say. Disputed. So I do know what that word means, but disputed means that you have like one person who's like, yes, this is really good, and then one person who's like, no, this is really bad. Like complete at odds with each other, different sides of the spectrum, and they just can't agree. So if we had one economist who's like, lowering taxes saves the economy, makes everything like the greatest it's ever been, and then another economist who's like, no, it like ruins the economy, makes it so terrible. We didn't really see that. We have a more like nuanced idea here. It's like more different factors being taken into consideration. It's like it's not necessarily good or bad. It just has different outcomes depending on who we're looking at. So I would say like a kind of really only a moderate likelihood. Like if we have literally no other choice, let's go for it, but I don't feel very confident. Then finally, uniform, definitely confident about that one as well. But like uniform, it's definitely not at all, like very low likelihood, because uniform means pretty much the exact opposite. It would mean that everything is the exact same, depending on where we are. So really between B and C, and here's kind of thing that might kind of change your way of looking at these questions. I would actually really go for B for the answer for this one, because disputed, I feel pretty confident about it that it's actually wrong. Equivocal, on the other hand, I only feel a little bit confident, but it seems like it's going to be right based off of my understanding of the word. So that's the kind of thing you have to think about. Like if you genuinely feel confident that the other ones, you know what they mean and that they're probably not going to be right, you might have to go for a word that you feel a little bit less confident in as for your actually understanding of its meaning, but one that just seems like it has a higher chance of it being right. I know this is a bit of a risk. I know these questions can be a bit risky when you end up doing stuff like this, but it's sometimes the situation you have to be in. Let me do this one real quick, and I'm going to actually use some more of the roots and prefixes for this question. So critics initially dismissed Zora Neale Hurston's use of dialect in Their Eyes Were Watching God as unsophisticated, but later scholars have come to view her linguistic choices as a blank artistic achievement that authentically captures the rhythms of Black Southern speech. So they initially thought that the dialects that she used in the story were just like pointless, like they weren't really helping anything. They just kind of made the story more lackluster. But in actuality, they realized it had an artistic value to them, that it actually was trying to capture what life was like for Black people in the South at that time. As for my prediction, I would say that it's I guess like a conscious idea. Like she specifically wanted to do this, and it was like part of the intention, I guess you could say. So now let's look at the choices, see which one matches. We have modest. Let's say I don't know what modest means. So let's say we only have like a low confidence. Modest, we have the word mod in there. So, okay, you might think like Discord mods, but no, that's not really what we're trying to look at here. Mod could also mean something like mode. I'm not sure if you know that from statistics. Mode is the most common thing in SAT data. So modest, it kind of gives me the idea of like something kind of in the middle. It's kind of something very common. I don't think it really works, because common artistic achievement, like a low artistic achievement, that's not really what they're trying to say here. So probably low likelihood as well. So probably wrong. Deliberate. What can we figure out with this stuff here? Well, we have liberate. Liberate, we know that means to like free someone, to save somebody from, I guess, like captivity. And then we have D. D means essentially entirely. So something that's like complete, something that's full. So, okay, so we have D, liberate, entirely free something. As for my confidence, as for whether I know it, I don't have much understanding of this word, let's say. But as for whether I think it could be right, I would say it's kind of like an okay amount. Like I feel, it could be right, entirely. It sounds like something very complete, something very big. So that could work. Actually, maybe it could be like it's freeing the thoughts from her mind. She effectively freed the thoughts, something like that. Controversial, contro, I know that definitely means something like against. So something, and you probably also just know the word controversial essentially means like people backlash to something. So I don't think that's what they're saying. We're trying to say something good here. So not really controversial, not something against anything. So probably not right there as well. Then finally, puzzling. You probably know what puzzling means, just kind of confusing, kind of weird. I think it's not really confusing or weird in this one. So that also would not be the case. So deliberate, even though we're not entirely sure what that word means, out of what we know about the etymology, out of what we're able to figure out, it definitely has the best shot out of the choices we're given. Okay, so real quick here, I just want to show another example of one type of vocab question you might see on the SAT. These don't show up that often, but sometimes they do. You might see a question where it says, as used in the text, what does this word mean? You just solve these the exact same way as all the other problems I've shown in this video. Well, let me just go over it real quick. So you read the passage like before. When marine biologists first surveyed the reef in 1987, they cataloged more than 200 species of fish thriving among the coral. Okay, so when they first looked at this coral reef a long time ago, they found a ton of fish there. By 2015, after decades of warming waters and agricultural runoff, the once vibrant ecosystem had been so denuded that researchers were able to complete the same survey in a fraction of the time, recording only a handful of species clinging on to bleached and crumbling structures. Okay, so they're saying that after some years had passed, there were so few animals left that they were able to like do really, really fast because there were just a few that they just had to look. They're like, okay, there's like 5 animals there, so that's it. Let me predict. What do I think the word denuded means? I would guess just means it was so bare, so like sparse essentially. We had no animals there. It was like empty, nobody's living there anymore. It's like, ghost town essentially. So yeah, let's say sparse. And now let's look at the choices and see which one matches. So obscured, okay, I do know what that means, but very low likelihood of that being right just because obscured, that means pretty much the exact opposite. That would indicate that there's so many animals that you don't even know what's going on anymore. So yeah, and also it kind of means like not, in case you didn't know, like obscured, obstruct, that kind of stuff. But yeah, regardless. Stripped, that means like to remove, to take everything away from something. Something is stripped down, it's very bare bones. So as you can guess, like, yeah, that really matches both things. I know what it means, and it also matches the prediction well. Transformed and abandoned, they both are okay. Like transformed especially is somewhat good, but it kind of lacks the connotation. We don't really have that kind of feeling of it just being like removed, bare bones. Transformed can mean anything. It can mean like they just replaced all the coral with like cotton candy or something. But that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at specifically removed a bunch of stuff. If you want to improve in vocab, the first thing I would recommend doing is actually learn the roots and prefixes. I'm not just trying to get you to join the course. Genuinely, this really does help so much because if you can actually decipher what these words mean, like I was able to do here, you can make so much more sense of them. If I did not know what D and liberate meant, I probably wouldn't have been able to figure that choice at all from what I was just given. So this is really, really helpful. Second thing, after you get past that, is just, okay, this is going to sound cringe. You're probably going to hate me for saying this, but genuinely just practice. But hear me out here. As you practice more and more SAT vocab questions, the thing that helps is that it makes you better at using this method. It makes you better at deciphering what words mean, and also exposes you to more and more words as well. You might be able to see words that appear again and again, occasionally, that you now know just because you've done so many questions. You just want to get really good at this process of reading these passages, making predictions, and also deciphering what words mean, even when you're not exactly sure. Nevertheless, I would say for vocab, it's the kind of thing you should focus at the later stages of your SAT prep journey. If you're just starting out, you should focus on the passage questions, on grammar, on transitions, that stuff. Vocab is the kind of thing where you can improve, like 100% you really can improve. Don't let anybody tell you you can't. But it should only be saved after you've done everything else. Both because the other stuff helps you with this, because it like helps you understand how to read passages better, but also just because it's higher leverage. Like you're more likely to improve in passage questions and grammar than in a vocab question. Next up is passage questions. This is going to be about 10 questions, the next 10 after vocab that you'll see on each reading and writing module. And here is that. SAT passage questions, often known as the hardest questions on the SAT by far out of everything that you're going to see on the test. And honestly, for pretty good reason, because they are just like pretty terrible overall. You have questions like this, where just all the stuff you have to read, you have to decipher, you have to infer different things about this text and figure out what is the correct answer based off of that. And I will definitely admit that they are very hard. And I think definitely I struggle with them a lot more than any other question type, for sure. But I think they are a lot simpler than you may initially expect. Not to say that they're easy, because simple and easy are definitely different things, but they're definitely simpler in terms of what you have to do and how to improve in them. You see, a lot of people think that there's some kind of like big technique as for how to select the right answer. Like people, like if you're really good at the SAT, you can have some kind of very special, unique way of selecting the right answer. Like you read this passage and you think, okay, I know that it has to be A and not B just because A has this word A in it, or like has this word repeats in it, and B does not have the word repeats in it, or I guess repeated but not repeats. And so therefore A must be the right answer because of this like complex algorithm that I use to define that A must be the right answer. But in actuality, that's not really what is going on for the most part. What really happens in passage questions is the vast majority, if you think about this pie chart as everything you need to do well on an SAT passage question, almost all of it, so let's say all the purple stuff here, just comes down to reading the passage well, your understanding of the passage. Genuinely, if you're a student who reads this passage and actually understands what's going on, like very in depth, you're going to probably have a low-key, simple time selecting the right answer choice. But if you're a student who reads this passage and does not understand what's going on, it's always going to be very, very difficult. It's going to be like you're playing the game literally on harder mode. There was one time, and I think I've said this a few calls before, where basically I was doing a call like this and I was trying to go through a very, very complex passage question that somebody gave me. And it was a really hard question, probably one of the hardest passage questions I've ever seen in my entire life, honestly. And I read through the passage and I really did not understand what it was saying. But I thought, okay, it's fine. Well, don't worry about it. I'll just go ahead and hopefully the choices will help me figure out what this passage is actually saying. So I went to the choices, and as you'd expect, the choices literally did not help me at all. I still completely did not understand it after reading the choices. And so I just kind of had to admit, like, okay, I don't really know how to do this question. So you can see, even if you are good with everything else, if you do not understand how the passage or like what the passage is saying, it's always going to be a very hard process. If you go back to this pie chart, this here is probably all I would attribute to the actual selection of the right answer. A much smaller segment of the overall chunk. Okay, so if you've been watching my videos before, you know that I basically suggest this 3-step process for going through SAT passage questions. And that's going to stay the same in this call, but I'll go into depth as for what each of these steps mean in a second. First thing is, of course, you have to read the passage. Pretty obvious, but I am going to say a little bit more in depth how to do this in a second. Second, making a prediction as for what you think the correct answer is going to be. This is going to be a lot more important than you may initially expect, so definitely make sure to always do this step 2. And then finally, step 3 is just go ahead and process of elimination, aka select the right answer based off of these first 2 steps. Sounds pretty simple. There's actually a lot more to it in each of these individual steps, and I'm just putting on here, so I'm going to go through all that in 1 second. Okay, so when you approach an SAT passage question for the first time, the first thing you have to do is read through the passage and try to read it very well. This alone is where most people kind of, get lost, where most people struggle. Because what you are trying to do as you read through this passage is basically make it so every single time you read a sentence, you summarize the sentence before moving on to the next sentence. I know this is a good strategy because I genuinely have used this myself. All the times I've gotten above 1,500 on the SAT, I've used this exact strategy, or I guess like 750 plus for reading and writing specifically. So I know this stuff works. It works for me, and it also just makes sense based off of how the passage works. Because if you think about it, this is kind of like what is called the Feynman technique. There's this big guy, well, not big in terms of size, but like big in terms of prowess, I guess, this big physicist, Richard Feynman, who came up with this idea that if you can explain something to another person, that typically shows that you really understand what you are saying. If I can understand something well enough that I could teach it to somebody else, I probably really understand that concept. But if you can't teach it to somebody else, then you probably don't understand it well enough. Like if I understand something like quantum physics, but I only understand it in like a very basic way, I may be able to make sense of it in my own mind, but I'm probably not going to be able to explain it to one of you if you ask me about it. And that shows that I don't really know it. So this is what you're trying to do with a passage. You're trying to basically make it so every single sentence, you literally can explain it as if somebody else asked you to do so. So I'm reading this here. Many municipalities have replaced their sodium vapor streetlights with light-emitting fixtures, expecting to save money and reduce light pollution. What would be my summary for that sentence? Well, if I'm trying to summarize it, I probably would say something like many cities, they've taken these regular streetlights and now they're using these LED streetlights instead. And they're trying to save money, it won't cost as much. And also they're trying to make it so it's less bright outside, less light pollution. So that's a summary as for what is being said. And notice when I make this summary, I'm trying to make it very basic and simple. I'm trying to make it so simple that it's like almost too simple. It almost sounds like I'm just making this really complex thing ultra basic. But that's a good thing. Because if you can make it ultra basic, if you can make it ultra simple, that is basically proof that you really understand it. There's another quote from another physicist, Einstein. Was he a physicist? Not really sure. But what he did was definitely physics related. And he said, if you cannot explain something simply, you don't understand it, which is definitely 100% true. If you can't explain it simply, definitely you don't get it well enough. Now, this is exactly what I would say to do, read each sentence and try to summarize it in your own words. But one more thing that I'll throw into this, another way you can think about this, if it makes it a little bit easier in your mind, is you are basically trying to visualize what is going on. So I had a student just last week who told me about this, and it wasn't the first time I've heard about this, but I think it's a really good way to think about it. Another thing you can just think about is try to visualize what is going on in the passage in your mind as you read. So for example, if I'm reading this, I could try to imagine, okay, so we have this city, and I'm imagining, okay, they're taking all the streetlights, and maybe like they're actually like people walking on the street and like removing the streetlights, like putting them in like a sack or something, and they're putting new streetlights in. And okay, I'm now imagining, okay, there's saving money. So like now less dollar bills going into this. I'm like literally imagining less dollars than there would have been otherwise. And also reduced light pollution. I'm imagining, okay, the city is now less bright. It's now not as aggressive lighting as it was before. So I'm imagining all of that in my mind, kind of like I'm reading a novel. You can think of it. It's like when you're reading a novel, you typically are like picturing it in your own mind as you're reading. That's what I'm kind of trying to do. So I'm not saying to do that as a replacement of this method. I'm just saying another way you can think about it. It functionally is the exact same thing as reading and summarizing each sentence. It's just another way to do it. So if that is simpler in your mind, if that makes it easier or better, you can definitely do it in that way. The one reason why I don't always suggest students to do it like that is just because it's harder to tell if you're actually doing it. Because if you're just visualizing, I can't like confirm that you're doing it. Like there's no way for me to look inside your brain and say, okay, Jimmy there is visualizing this passage. When you summarize, though, you can show that you understand it because you can actually say it out loud to me. So that's the one thing that makes this a little bit easier. But other than that, it's pretty fair. So yeah, that's the main stuff here. Trying to make it as basic as possible. Try to do stuff. A lot of students, when they try to do this for the first time, they kind of just like give synonyms for every single word in the sentence. Like they may say, many cities have taken out and put back in their Na+, okay, I mean, if they want to bring chemistry into this, streetlights with LED streetlights, expecting to reduce money and reduce light brightness. You can see there, yes, that was a summary of that sentence, but I basically was just saying the exact same words and just taking in slightly different words for every single word being given there. That is not what you're trying to do, because if you just do that, it's not really interacting with your brain the way you need to unlock the Feynman technique. It's just kind of like, if I was reading quantum physics and I just took each word and just found a slightly different word to replace it. I'm not going to actually understand quantum physics. The only way you understand is if you can actually take this and break it down and say it in a much simpler, much more basic way than it was before, like I said before, with the saving money, reducing light brightness, they're taking it out, putting back in, that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be ultra different from how it is originally, but it should be at least fairly so. So I'll go through the rest of this question and do the other two steps of the process as we get to it. So many municipalities have replaced okay, I read that one. And then in one Midwestern city, researchers tracked energy use, sky glow, insect activity, and bird collisions before and after a pilot conversion from sodium lamps to this. Okay, so basically they just tracked different things. I don't need to memorize all the different things, but they just tracked different things both before they did the change and then also after they did the change as well. Okay, then the city used 35% less electricity, but traps between the cool white LEDs captured roughly 3 times as many insects as before, and springtime collisions of migrating birds with glass bus shelters rose by about 15%. Okay, so there are a lot of words in that sentence. That's a very long sentence. It went from here all the way to down here. When you have ultra long sentences like that, it can be useful to not just summarize the entire sentence, but actually summarize just pieces of the sentence to make it even simpler than it was before. So if we just try to do that, we can say the city used 35% electricity. Okay, so the city reduced the electricity use a lot, but traps between the cool white LEDs captured roughly 3 times as many insects as before. Okay, so there were many more insects that were being caught essentially by the lights than there were before. The lights are really, in some ways, I guess there's like insects that are like running into the light, like you might see in like a computer screen, I guess, if you have a fly in the room, like they're trying to touch the lights, they're really like attracted to it. And then also the collisions of migrating birds rose by about 15%. Okay, so the birds were also attracted to the light. They're like running into the light, not very smart birds. So less electricity, good thing, but then all these other bad things. It's really hurting the insects and stuff. Midway through the pilot, the city switched the same quarters to warmer LEDs and added full cutoff shields while keeping a dimming schedule. Okay, let me just summarize that part because, again, really complicated here. So midway through their experiment, they switched the thing to warmer LEDs, so a different kind of light. They took the light that was in there, I'm imagining it again in my mind, they're taking the light and now they're replacing a different kind of light in there instead. And then they added full cutoff shields while keeping the dimming schedule. Okay, so shields, I assume that probably is saying something along the lines of like they are providing protection from the stuff, like providing a barrier, I guess, that maybe stops the insects from getting into it and the birds. The increased sky glow and wildlife impacts then dropped close to pre-conversion levels while energy savings persisted. Okay, so now it's saying here that the wildlife, all the bad stuff that's happening to the birds and the insects, and the pollution dropped again, no bad stuff, but they also got to save their energy, got to save their electricity. Okay, based on the findings, the research team suggests that future lighting upgrades in the city should blank. This brings me down to step number 2 of the process, which is makes a prediction for the answer choice. This is something that a lot of students don't do, and the reason why you should do it is because basically it's going to, one, check to make sure you actually understand the passage, and second, essentially like prime your brain to be able to actually have a better chance of telling whether the right answer is right. I had a whole example that I explained in another call, but it's kind of like I told you the word anger. If I just said anger, and then I showed you like a picture of a neutral face, like a neutral human face, you probably would perceive that face as just maybe a little bit more angry than it would be otherwise, just because I said the word anger right before you did. It's like psychological, like a psychological thing, just influencing your ability to realize that that face is like maybe angry. And so that's what you're trying to do with here. Before you even look at the choices, you should try to predict what you think the correct answer is. So that way when you see that answer in here or a similar one, it will kind of like jump out at you. You'll be like, oh my gosh, that is that answer that I was just thinking about literally right now that I like had in my mind before this. I probably should choose that answer. It probably is right. So for your prediction in this step, you don't have to make it all confusing or complicated. All you have to do is just say in a general sense what you think the correct answer is going to be. Give your best shot, give your best answer, and most of the time it's probably going to be pretty close. Even if it's not exactly close, it's still beneficial to do so because it proves that you understood what the passage was saying. If you can't make a prediction, that's usually an indication that you've read this whole passage and you don't really fully understand it. And so that's an indication you should go back and maybe reread some parts of it again. So for this passage, probably my prediction would be that based on the findings, they suggest that they should do this warmer LED light and also add the cutoff shields. That seemed to pretty much solve all the problems, protected the animals, but also protected the energy and the money and stuff. So that's probably the best idea here. And then finally what we get here is the process of elimination. So basically you look at these four choices now, and you try to eliminate every single wrong choice that is given to you. This is kind of different from what a lot of students do because a lot of students, when they go through the choices, they just try to think to themselves, which one is the best choice being given here? Like, okay, if you're trying to rank each choice, maybe this one is like a 6 out of 10 choice, this is a 7 out of 10 choice, this is an 8 out of 10 choice, and then this is a 9 out of 10 choice, so I should go for the 9 out of 10 choice. That's not really how the SAT typically works. More how it works is that there's going to be something very wrong with choice A, so there's going to be something very wrong with choice B, there's going to be something very wrong with choice C, and then D is just the one that doesn't have anything really wrong with it. And when I say something really wrong, I don't mean something like completely groundbreaking, terrible about the entire choice. I just mean maybe like it has a word in here that is not supported, or it has just some random idea in here that maybe just a small part of it that is not really said in the passage. And just to explain what I mean by this, you're trying to find a choice that is entirely supported by the passage. When I say supported, I don't literally mean that it has to have the exact same wording in the passage. I just mean the idea has to be present in the passage in some way. There has to be something in this that would suggest the idea that's said here for every single thing said in the choice. One way you can think about this is in terms of assumptions and supported things. This is a really good exercise that helps people a lot. Basically, what you want to think is it an assumption or is it supported by what the passage is saying? The difference is, if it is an assumption, there's some other explanation for what was happening there. If it's supported, that means that literally the only explanation has to be the claim. Okay, that doesn't really make sense without an example, so let me do that. We have here the cafe switched to oat milk in March. By June, its monthly sales had risen 40%. Then it says here, the switch caused the sales increase. Would that be an assumption or would that be supported? Well, what you have to think to yourself, is there another scenario besides this in which the sales could increase? Yes, there are many different reasons why the sales can increase. There could have just been a brand new influx of people. Maybe it was like the World Cup, like it is right now, or I guess like it was right now. And so as a result, a lot more people were going to that cafe because they were just really coming in for the World Cup. Maybe there was some other big thing that was going on, like with politics, with the economy, some other promotion that were causing more people to buy from this cafe. We don't know if it was purely the oat milk switch which caused the increase. So therefore, that would be an assumption rather than supported. Another much easier example I can give is if I said, okay, it's dark in my room where I am right now as I'm recording this video. That means that it must be nighttime where I am right now. Yes, that could be a plausible reason, but that's just an assumption because there's many reasons why my room could be dark where I am right now. I could just literally have the lights turned off, which I do have the lights turned off. I guess it's actually pretty much the only reason. But okay, yes, it could be the case I just have a regular room, it's daytime, I just have all the lights turned off. So there's another way in which that could work. It's not the only way in which my room could be dark. So therefore, it would be an assumption, not supported. Let's go through the rest of these. Every student who completed the diagnostic scored above 1,200 on the practice test that followed. Mariah completed the diagnostic, so she scored above 1,200 on the practice test. Would that be an assumption or would it be supported? Is there another world in which this could be the case without this being true? Well, it says here that every student who completed the diagnostic scored above 1,200. Assuming Maria is a student, which she probably is based off the fact that she's saying this here, that would be 100% supported. Because there's no other scenario. It says literally every student. There's no exceptions out of what it's saying. If it said almost every student, then of course there could be an exception there. But it says literally every student, so therefore it has to be actually supported here. Researchers found that the coral samples taken from the waters showed more bleaching than those from cooler waters. Claim warmer waters associated with more bleaching in these coral samples. Would that be assumption or would it actually be supported? In this example, it also would be supported because keep in mind here, it's saying here that the warmer water is associated with more bleaching. It doesn't say that 100% of the time there's going to be more bleaching. It just says there's a correlation, there's a connection between the two. And so, if they're more bleaching, that would be supporting the idea that there is some kind of connection. It's not absolute in this. Finally, this last one here, the novel saw poorly on release but is now considered a classic, taught in most university literature courses. Claim the novel is more respected now than it was at release. So this would be an assumption. That is probably the case that's more respected now than it was at least, but there could be a variety of different reasons why it is taught in most university literature courses. It could just be the case that it's really easy to get the copyright and the right to teach this specific novel, and so therefore that is why it is taught in many things. It could just be the case that it sold poorly on release, but that doesn't actually mean that it wasn't critically acclaimed. Like they still thought it was good, just a lot of people didn't really get into it. A lot of people didn't know about it. There are other scenarios in which this could be the case other than the novel was more respected than was it released. So this would just be an assumption based off what's said here. Okay, so going on to this now, we're going to use this exact same logic as for reading this. So we're trying to look at each of these choices and think to ourselves, is it entirely supported by all the ideas suggested in here, or is there anything here that is not supported? Okay, so with choice A, is saying here they think that it should continue installing unshielded cool white LEDs at current brightness. Okay, so the unshielded cool white LEDs, that was the ones that were causing all the problems up here with the insects and the birds. So there wouldn't really be anything here saying that they want to continue installing them. So that would definitely be not supported. B, reinstall sodium vapor lamps across the city to eliminate added sky glow and reduce insect and bird impacts. Sodium vapor lamps, oh wait, that is the one. Oh yeah, up here it says that these were the original ones they had. So they also would not be wanting to do that because that's the ones that had the original problems and have all this. So probably not that either. Not really supported. C, install warmer, fully shielded LEDs to cut sky glow and wildlife impacts while keeping the energy savings. So warmer, fully shielded ones, those are the ones that were talked about here at the end. So that would be supported. All that would make sense because they're saying here that these are the good ones while the rest are the bad ones. So C would be right here. D, pause further upgrades until additional studies confirm whether the pilot's changes truly reduce sky glow and collisions. It doesn't say anything here about needing more studies. If it said something literally here about it wasn't sufficient or there wasn't enough information, maybe that could work. But again, nothing here to support that. So this idea about more studies would be just incorrect information, not supported. And so therefore, we've eliminated A, B, and D, so we now know for sure that C is correct. Technically, though, I probably should not have selected that before I actually had eliminated the three wrong ones because that's more how you're supposed to do it. Okay, so this is all the basics of it. Now I'm just going to go through a few more examples and say some other strategy stuff about the passage questions as well. So same process here, just going to go through the exact same thing again. Step 1, some reviewers treat repeated phrases in short songs as mere reinforcement, as if a chorus could only hammer home a single message. Okay, so they're saying here that when there's a repeated phrase in a song, like when they say the same thing again and again, like a chorus, that a lot of people think it's just reinforcement. It can just like hammer home a thing. It doesn't like add anything new with every single chorus. But in many narrative ballads, the chorus returns after each verse at a moment where the story has subtly changed. A line that first sounds like celebration may, after new details emerge, feel ironic or even bitter. Okay, so now they're saying here that yes, they are changing. Maybe they have this verse and then they have a chorus and the first chorus is like happy, but then they have another verse and a chorus, but then this chorus is like sad. So that is what can happen here. Then they say here, songwriters who lean into this fact use repetition less to freeze an idea in place than to track a speaker's shifting relationship to it as the narrative unfolds. So they're saying here, like, you can have a singer who is like changing how they think about this chorus as the song goes through its motions. Like they first may have a positive feeling about it, and then they have a negative feeling, maybe then they have a neutral feeling. So it can change as the song evolves. For my prediction here is asking what statement of repetition in a narrative ballad is most strongly supported by the text. Now, this one, it's harder to make a prediction because it's literally asking for stuff that you can only see after you look at the choices, but you can still make a prediction because our prediction is just a guess as for what the correct answer is going to be. So I can still guess what I think it's probably going to be the answer. I'm probably assuming it's going to say something along the lines of choruses can change their meaning as you go through a song. It can have different meanings as you go through each individual verse. That's the truth about it. It's not just a core idea that just stays the same the whole time. That's my prediction. 3, we look at this and let's do the process of elimination again on this. A narrative ballad repeats its chorus mainly to keep the song's message consistent so the chorus's meaning stays essentially the same each time it returns. Non-support at all, it says literally the exact opposite. It is pretty much going to be the opposite every single time it returns. So therefore, or not the opposite, but just different every single time it returns. So A would be wrong. B, a narrative ballad can use a repeated chorus to take on new shades of meaning since later verses change how the same words are interpreted. That seems entirely supported. Yes, new shades of meaning, reasonable, all that seems right. So B is probably going to be correct here, but let's just look at the rest. In a narrative ballad, a repeated chorus primarily helps the narrator arrive at a clear final position by restating the central idea with increasing certainty. Now, a student might feel a little bit better about that choice, but it says here it arrives at a clear final position. It doesn't necessarily say anything about like a final position, about anything about it eventually coming to this like final idea at the end of the thing. So probably it's not saying anything about increasing certainty, not anything about a final position. So though it seems okay, it would have some parts here that are just a little bit not entirely supported by the thing. D, a narrative ballad makes its chorus feel different mostly by changing the song's tempo. Okay, I can even just tell there. We don't even have to read the choice entirely if we can tell immediately that there's something wrong with it. Tempo, we don't hear anything about tempo, so D would be wrong. Therefore, B is going to be the correct answer for this one here. So I'm going to go over a specific thing with each of these 3 following examples. First one here, what to do when you have multiple choices that both look like they can be the correct answer. So this happens a lot. I've had a lot of students telling me that this is something that they keep noticing again and again. They always say, I'm so close to choosing the right answer, but I just get down to 2 choices and they both always feel exactly right. I don't know which one to pick. The way to think about this is kind of like, I'm not sure if you've seen any like cartoon, I guess it could happen in a sitcom as well, but some kind of cartoon where you have like a bad guy, you know, it's like a very niche example, but I think you probably know what I'm talking about. You have like a bad guy and somehow there's a bad guy and a good guy who both look exactly the same. Like maybe they had some kind of spell being put on them to make them both look exactly alike. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Oh yeah, maybe like that SpongeBob episode where they have the Robo Mr. Krabs and then the regular Mr. Krabs, and SpongeBob is trying to figure out like which one is the right one, and like he has to like destroy one and like keep with the other one. So this happens. What does the character typically do when this happens? When they have both a good guy and a bad guy, and they're trying to figure out which one is the good guy, which one's the bad guy, so I guess they know which one to like destroy. Well, they always just try to see what is some kind of small difference between the 2 things. And it might be something very small because they're going to look exactly the same. But maybe like this guy, like SpongeBob episode, they talk about the like Krabby Patty formula. The real Mr. Krabs knows the Krabby Patty formula, whereas the fake Mr. Krabs, he probably will have no idea. Though I think there was some like confusion with that as well. So that could be a small difference. Maybe it's something like one person has this specific quirk that the other person does not have. So they are the real person. Maybe it's like one person is, I don't know, they know some kind of like secret, well, I guess that's back with the secret formula thing, but they know some piece of information that only that person would know. And so with that, they can typically find out, okay, this person does not know the secret information. That's not the right person. Whereas this person does know the secret information. This would be the correct person. And so that's basically what you're trying to do with these choices. When there are multiple ones that all look correct, you just try to think to yourself, okay, it's going to be something very, very small, but there must be some small factor that I'm missing between 2 of the choices that makes the incorrect one incorrect and the correct one correct. And it's going to be something very small. It's going to be something so small that most students would just miss it if they see it the first time. But that's why passage questions are hard. That's why they are difficult. That's why it takes skill to do them, because you're trying to find these very small differences. Okay, let me go through this question real quick. Same process as usual. Read it. A regional newspaper printed in 1842 describes Cedar Landing on the Ohio River as a place where farmers could leave produce to be taken downriver. So there's this place, this settlement basically, where people leave their items and then they're taken down the river. Okay. Other evidence, however, strongly supports a founding date of 1851 for the town of Cedar Landing, including a state charter and surveys indicating the town lots were first laid out in that year. So these people are saying that 1842 was not when this thing was made, it was 1851. And they know this because they only had actual town lots. So where's town lots? Yeah. So like basically they only actually had a town in 1851 and later. Okay. If both the 1842 newspaper account and the 1851 founding date are correct, that would imply that, okay, so they're saying here that it's correct about the 1842 thing. They did exist in 1842, but it's also correct in 1851, that was the first time they actually had like an actual like town settlement there. So what would that imply? For my prediction here, I would probably guess something along the lines of like in 1842, it was just like a produce trading place. This was just a random like place on the docks. They could just leave their produce and it was taken down river. It wasn't really a town. There's not really anybody living there. There wasn't any kids, any like, people besides farmers. It was just the farmers and they just went there like maybe once like a month or something. Meanwhile, in 1851, they probably had like an actual town. They actually had like a grocery store. They probably had an actual restaurant, like restaurants, businesses. They had actual people living there, suburbs, that kind of stuff. So that's what would happen in 1851. And so that's why there's this discrepancy. That's my prediction. Now, I know that was a pretty long prediction, but it doesn't have to be that long. That's just to really make sure you understand what I'm saying. Okay, now step 3, process of elimination. We're going to look and see where are the incorrect parts. The name Cedar Landing referred in 1842 to an unincorporated settlement rather than a formerly chartered town. That seems reasonable. 1842, unincorporated settlement, rather than a formerly chartered town. Had something in 1842 that was not a full town. That sounds right. B, the location served as an informal river landing before it became an officially chartered town in 1851. That also sounds pretty good. That's also completely supported. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. C, the state charter issued in 1851 merely confirmed boundaries that had already been formally established for Cedar Landing. That also sounds low-key pretty good. Okay, so we have a lot of choices that all sound pretty good for this one. The 1842 newspaper likely used the name Cedar Landing for a different landing site along the Ohio River. That is the one that I would actually go as far as say is not supported because they don't say anything here about them being in different locations. That would be much more of an assumption, not really anything here that would really lay out that fact. So D would be wrong. But okay, we have A, B, and C. So now we have to look at these small intricacies. So we can literally go word by word. What is one small factor that would make each one incorrect besides the correct one? I'll go through each one. The name Cedar Landing, okay, that sounds right so far, referred in 1842 to an unincorporated settlement. So the key thing I'm seeing there is this word settlement. Settlement implies the idea that there is like already a full town being located there. It implies that there's already being a grocery store, businesses, restaurants, all that stuff. It just says here unincorporated. So that would be the idea that they had like a town, they just didn't call it a town. Like, I'm trying to think of a good example of that throughout history. Let's say that there's like 10,000 people living in like a 100-mile radius, or let's say like 50-mile radius. You probably would say that there's like a settlement there. There are people living there. But maybe they have not actually decided to call it a town. Maybe they've not actually decided to say that this is New York City, or this is Los Angeles, this is San Francisco. They just have a bunch of people living in a random place. That would be an unincorporated settlement. It is basically a town. It just doesn't have the name of a town. So that's not really what's going on here. I had my prediction being like they probably just had farmers there, nothing else. So therefore, this settlement idea, even though it's literally just one word, would make this one incorrect and I'd have to get rid of A. So you can see small differences, very small differences there. B, the location served as an informal river landing. Okay, informal river landing, that sounds right, as I said here, informal, before it became an officially chartered town in 1851. Okay, that's basically my exact prediction. Sounds exactly right. Probably going to be the right answer, but let's just check on C. What would be wrong with C? The state charter issued in 1851 merely confirmed boundaries that had already been formally established for Cedar Landing. The reason C would be wrong in this thing is because basically it is saying the same thing as A. It says the state charter issued in 1851 merely confirmed boundaries that had already been formally established. So confirming boundaries, that would indicate that they already again had a full city. They would already had a formal town in here. It just says that this would be like in name only. They just threw the name Cedar Landing officially on it. That's not what it's saying here. It's rather saying it was basically the case that farmers were just using this as like a trading station and there's not really any other town being built here until much later. So that's why it cannot be C for that one. Kind of the same reason as B, but again, it's like a very small factor. So therefore, we have to go for B then as the final correct answer for that one. So that's what you always do when you have more than one correct. You just try to go word by word and look for incorrect parts and just eliminate those. Now, another thing that I want to go over real quick is one really important factor here, which is the importance of taking notes. So I'm not somebody who's going to tell you that you should take notes every single time you should read a passage. I think that's a little bit overkill. I don't think you need to do that. The way you should use notes on the SAT is use it for when you have a very, very complex passage that is just not making sense otherwise. So if you're reading this passage and you're just you can tell that this is not making sense, I don't really know what's going on here, this is kind of confusing, then write down notes like on the scratch pad that you should hopefully be given on the test of what the important information is, and write it in a way that you can very easily understand, and also in a way where it's very little stuff being written down. So I'll give an example on this one, but again, only use this as like a last resort if it really is not making sense, because this is going to take a lot more time and you don't want to be using this much time on the average passage question. So I'll take notes for this one. Many popular accounts of a city's first curbside recycling initiative describe it as a short-lived publicity effort that changed little beyond residents' sorting habits. Okay, so I'm trying to write notes on that. I would say something like the CRI, Curbside Recycling Initiative. It was just, I would just say basically like NG, not good. Like, yeah, that's really all that I'm trying to say here. The initiative was not good. Environmental historian Lena Perez, drawing on municipal procurement files, sanitation department logs, and neighborhood surveys, okay, so a bunch of stuff, argues that although participation rates soon leveled off, the program's tracking forms and reporting routines became models for how later waste management contracts were monitored. Okay, so it actually had some longer term benefits. So it wasn't good in the, let's say, short term, but it was good, let's say, in the long term. So full disclosure, I probably would not say this is really a passage that is confusing enough to warrant notes. I probably would say that you don't need to take notes on this one. This probably would not be a really good choice to take notes on in terms of passages to take notes on. But if you do want to take notes, this is probably how it would look. And keep in mind, I'm making this very, very simple and very, very bare bones. You can tell here, like, this is barely legible. This does not make sense what is being said here if you did not literally follow along with my logic. CRI, NG, G, like, this does not make sense at all. And so that's how you want your notes to be. It should not make sense for a person looking at it what is being said here. Because if it does, that's an indication you've written down way too much and you're spending way too much time writing notes. This is just like an extra useful tool for you. It's not supposed to be like the whole passage summarized in a way that's easy to understand. I know like this is kind of really hard because many smart students would think to themselves, okay, I should try to make it as complex, as detailed as possible, because they have this idea that, more complexity, more detail is a good thing. That's not really what is going on here. We want to make it just very bare bones and almost illegible to a person looking on it. Now, if we're looking at this one here, which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? I did not go over underlined sentence questions earlier on in this, but basically all you need to know for this is they function the exact same way. The only thing that's different is you just have to look specifically at this underlined sentence and understand what is going on here. It does not matter anything else said elsewhere in the passage. It just matters what is going on in the underlined sentence for the answer to this question. So if it's not in the underlined sentence, it should not be the right answer. But otherwise, it's just the same stuff for looking for what is supported, what is an assumption, etc. So the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole, I would guess that the function is basically, it's presenting what most people think about this initiative. Most people thought that it had this overall idea, and then they're going to talk a little bit later about how it's changed. So it presents a common view that the recycling initiative had little lasting impact, which the text then complicates by distinguishing limited behavior change from enduring administrative routines. So that seems exactly right. It says it's a common view that had lasting impact, which the text then complicates. Notice here how it says that it then complicates it. That's important because it has to be saying that it's something other than what is written in the underline itself for that part, because that's not contained within the underlined. The part about complicating it is after that. So the fact that they say then complicates, that's important because it shows that it's not within the underlined portion itself for that part. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, A is probably going to be right here. But let's look at the rest. B, it provides neutral background about municipal sanitation programs so that Perez's research materials in the next sentence are easier for the reader to follow. So neutral background about municipal sanitation programs. Okay, I thought it was going to be very easy, but actually, yeah, I think it's probably another example where we have two choices that both appear to be pretty supported. So I'll say that one for the end and then look at it in a second. C, It asserts the author's own evaluation that the recycling initiative ultimately failed. Okay, so it doesn't say anything about it failing. Actually, no, I guess it kind of does. Authors, okay. Same next sentence, as evidence drawn from archival records. I don't think there's anything about archival records specifically said here. That would indicate something like old records. I think, okay, probably it's not really saying ultimately failed. That seems like it's going a little bit beyond what's being said here. It just says that it wasn't that effective. Not the idea that it literally failed. That failed would be like a very strong thing, like it's saying that it completely was like completely pointless, like literally like no benefit at all. I don't think it's saying that. It says it changed little beyond, so that would indicate maybe it did change a little bit, but not a complete failure. I think C would be not support for those reasons. D, it introduces Perez's main claim that the initiative shaped a later waste management. Okay, so that is not really said at all until later on in the passage. It doesn't say anything about shaping later waste management, so that would not be supported. You know, if they were looking at like this sentence, maybe that would be the answer, but since it's this sentence, it would not be. Okay, so we're between A and B for the answers here. And we're trying to see now, where is some small detail with one of these that are making not supported? It presents a common view that the recycling initiative had little lasting impact. Okay, so that seems exactly supported. Not a complete failure, but just little lasting impact. Which the text then complicates by distinguishing limited behavior change. So yeah, limited behavior change, they say something like that. If they're saying here that the overall thing was like a model, but just the short-term behavior change maybe wasn't that much. And then from enduring administrative routines. Okay, yeah, so that's what she's saying here, how it had broader things that it became like a model for other stuff. B, it provides neutral background about municipal sanitation programs. Okay, so actually, yeah, I can see here what would be the incorrect part about this, about municipal sanitation programs. That's not really what's going on here, because we're not talking about municipal sanitation programs in general. We're not just talking about the idea of a municipal sanitation program. We're talking about specifically this one city's municipal sanitation programs, or the program specifically. For those reasons, there was some incorrect parts about B, so therefore A would be the correct answer for that one. So yeah, the big thing, as well as the notes, I mean, not really that important for this one, but it did maybe make a little more sense. If I was confused about what was actually going on here, we can see a bit more, up here, like not good in the short term, good in the long term. That kind of stuff. Last thing I want to say is that a big question I get asked a lot about these passage questions is, what do you do when you read through a question and you don't know specifically what some of the words mean? And people say that this is like a really big issue. Like they're really struggling with this. Like it's such a big, thing that they can't figure out what these words mean. And so that's ruining everything for them. The way I want you to think about it is kind of like this. When you read a random sentence, like let's just say you read this first sentence from this to that. And let's say that had, it probably has like a lot of words in there. So let's say it has 15 words. Maybe it has more, but 15 seems like a very, probably more like 20. I'd say probably 20 words in that sentence. All you really need is to know the majority of those words. It doesn't matter if like you only know 17 out of those 20 words. You will have more than enough information from the 17 out of 20 to understand the full thing. It's not like those 3 words are going to completely ruin everything. I mean, it's kind of just like anything in life. Like, if you're in a group of like 20 people, maybe you have 3 people who are like really annoying, really, really bad to work with. But if 17 of them are all like good, hardworking, honest people, it's probably going to be overall a fairly good time. Like, it's not going to be that bad. Maybe those 3 people would be like really annoying. Maybe they'll try to like monopolize the attention, but it's probably not going to be that bad. Likewise, like say you're reading some long science article. It's okay if you don't know what a couple of the words mean, as long as you understand the overall idea being suggested by the article. Like, we're not experts. You probably are not going to know what every single word means. That's kind of like a utopian idea that you understand what every single word in the passage means. What's more going to be the case is you understand most of the words, and then when you don't know specific words, the other words in the sentence should be enough to indicate what those mean. So it's all about the context. You probably have heard your English teacher say before, it's all about context. Like if you're reading a complex piece of literature, you can use the other words to figure out what the specific words mean. That's exactly what I'm saying here as well. And I kind of proved this one time with a student. I had a student one time, and he was not a native English speaker. He was really struggling with vocab with passage questions. Like, he really did not get the vocab portion of these questions. And so he would always tell me this exact thing, that there's all these words that he just did not know no matter how hard he tried. And what I literally did with him is I just asked him, I literally went word by word in the passage, and I said, okay, bro, do you know what this word means? And he said, yes. Do you know what this word means? And he said, yes. Do you know what this word means? He said, yes. And I just did that for the entire thing. And there were like maybe a couple of words where he's like, oh, I have no idea what that means. Like, that makes no sense to me at all. Like, I'm completely confused. But almost every single one he did. And he knew more than enough to understand what the entire thing was saying. Like, there were a few words he was completely confused on, but he knew plenty with just the other words to understand the sentence. And so I asked him about every single word, and I did not define any of the words he didn't know. And he knew more than enough to answer the question. He got it right. So it's like, I should prove to him basically, firsthand that he knew enough to understand the thing. And then afterwards, he was like amazed. He was like, oh my gosh, I guess I actually do know a lot more than I originally thought. And I was like, yeah, you do. So step 1. Ecologist Mira Patel argues that urban light pollution changes how nocturnal insects move through a city. Okay, so already in just that sentence, you probably have a few things you maybe do not know. Urban light pollution, you might not know what that means. How nocturnal insects, maybe you don't know what nocturnal means, move through a city. We can just use the words around it to make good guesses as for what this means, though. So she's probably arguing that light pollution, what is, pollution, it means like it's getting everywhere. Like if you have garbage pollution, it's like garbage is all throughout the city. If you have like, what other pollution can you have? Like, smoke pollution, smoke pollution, as we just experienced in the US, in the upper US, or I guess throughout the entirety of the US on the East Coast, pollution when stuff gets everywhere and it's not supposed to be there. So light pollution, it's probably the idea that there's way too much light in the city. I'm thinking like Times Square. If you go to Times Square in New York City, it basically feels like it's daytime, even if it's literally nighttime, because it's so much brightness, so much pollution of light. So that's probably what light pollution means. How nocturnal insects. Nocturnal, I'm just going to say, like, it literally doesn't even matter if you don't know what nocturnal means. It just matters you know what an insect is. As long as you know what an insect is, you're fine. So, like, yeah, it really doesn't matter here. Okay. So I knew, like, every word here, maybe except light pollution and then nocturnal, more than enough to solve it. I guess if you didn't know what urban means, again, it doesn't really matter too much. Like, as long as you know the rest, it's pretty much fine. She warned that many discussions treat brightness as a single uncomplicated factor. So a little bit of confusing stuff here, but the overall idea that I think I'm getting here is that brightness, so basically like how aggressive the lights are, is just like one thing. A lot of people say it's just like one small factor and it's not a broad scale thing, I guess. Kind of confused about what that means myself, honestly, but I think we'll make some more sense as we go through the rest. To separate brightness from other features of artificial light, so brightness from other features, okay, so there are different things that artificial light can do, and brightness is just one of them. So maybe artificial light is saying it can add nice ambience, it can add nice like atmosphere to a place. So brightness is not its only factor. Maybe stuff like that. Patel's team compared 2 nearly identical parks that use the same type of LED lamp. So 2 different parks, but they had the same lamp within them. When the lamps in one park were fitted with shields redirect the light downward, the number of moths drawn into traps, they were dropped by almost half. Okay, so they had shields, so they had like masks on it, that made the light go downward. And then the moths were not drawn into them as much. If you don't know what a moth is, you just need to know it's some kind of animal. Even though the measured light level at ground height stayed about the same. Okay, so basically it's saying here that the direction of the light mattered more than just the brightness itself. So the moths, they were not really, too interested in the light when it was going downwards just because it was going down. Patel notes that this pattern points to the importance of where light is sent, not just how much is produced, and she suggests that cities could reduce ecological disruption without fully dimming streets. Okay, so yeah, basically, doesn't matter as much the exact brightness, just matters where the light is going, and that's the main thing here. So even if you didn't know some of these words, you can tell here, you probably know more than enough to actually understand what is going on for the most part. For my prediction, the function of the underlined sentence, the sentence is talking here about the experiment. So I guess basically the function of the underlined sentence is it provides information about how the experiment, or like what the experiment showed. So what actually happened in it. So the moths, this is what they found by doing the experiment. Okay, so A, it provides background information about the park so that the reader can understand why these conditions were difficult to control. So yeah, not really any background information about the parks. That's not really supported at all. Nothing about, what the parks are typically like or anything like that. So that would not be right. B, it introduces an unexpected exception to the idea that reducing light pollution can lessen insects' attraction to urban environments. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. Like, yeah, unexpected exception to the idea that reducing light pollution can lessen, attraction. So exception, like, this thing, it was not just the brightness itself that was doing it. So I'll keep B in for sure. C, it shifts the focus from Patel's caution about oversimplifying brightness to a broader criticism of how cities choose lighting technologies. Okay, so yeah, not really anything about a broader criticism in here. That's not really what the idea is. It's not like, they went from like talking about lights to being like a huge cultural criticism of how the whole city functions and all that stuff. So not C. D, it presents a specific experimental result that supports and refines the text claim about what aspects of artificial light affect insect behavior. Okay, so that also seems to be pretty good. D and B both seem to be very fair ones. So let's look here. What are some incorrect parts about one of them? It introduces an unexpected exception to the idea that reducing light pollution can lessen insects' attraction to urban environments. So reducing light pollution. I understood light pollution as meaning all like the factors of light. Like when it says here it directs the light downward, that would be a reduction in light pollution. But honestly, yeah, maybe light pollution. I guess it might be kind of saying that light pollution is just the brightness itself. Okay, yeah, so maybe that could work. It says like can lessen insects' attraction to urban environments. Urban environment, that would mean like the city environment as a whole. That would be indicating that the insects are just like less drawn to cities in general. We didn't really see anything about that. It's not like the moths all decide to like move to like Florida or something just because they had less light pollution or something like that, or that they had more light pollution. And then like exception as well. I guess it's also not really an exception because yeah, no matter how you slice it, I guess it kind of is like saying, you know, if it is light pollution that they're reducing, then that would not really be an exception because yeah, less moths, you know, less light pollution equals less moths getting damaged. If it is not light pollution, then it wouldn't even matter because yeah, then they wouldn't be injured. Yeah, so okay, yeah, so I can see some cracks in this no matter what way you slice it. So yeah, I think B would definitely not be correct for a few different small reasons there. So then, therefore, we have to go for D. It presents a specific experimental result that supports and refines the text claim about what aspects of artificial light affect insect behavior. So specific experimental result, that's definitely what it shows, and all this other stuff here as well. So that would be the last thing there. One more thing on this idea, I had this example that I showed in one of the other videos on the channel before. So one like smaller additional example with this is if you have a poem question. So, you know, some questions on the SAT can be poems as well. And so this requires a similar kind of thing. You may see a poem on the SAT, and it may seem like it's really confusing, it makes no sense, you have no idea what's going on here. And that may be the case, because poems are often written a really long time ago, nobody really writes poems these days, so it probably doesn't make too much sense what the poem is saying. But when you see a poem on the SAT, what you just have to do is just look at each line and think to yourself, what makes the most sense for what it says? And just take a guess, and chances are your guess is probably going to be actually correct. And so a similar thing with this, like if you know the majority of the words that are being said here, it's probably more than enough to figure out whatever random words you still do not know. Okay, so we're looking at this one now, this random poem. It's a poem about an orchard in late autumn. So this is, yeah, apple orchards, something like that. The last fruit fell before I came to take it. Okay, so it's saying here that a fruit like apple, it fell on the ground. I found it bedded in the frostbit grass. Okay, so it was falling in the grass was cold, all that stuff. Its bright side turned to earth as if to make it a private matter and to let it pass. So bright side turned to earth, that means that basically the shiny part of it would be on the ground, so you can't see the shiny part. So it's almost like it's trying to hide itself, I guess. I had supposed the tree kept some account of hands that pruned, of summers I had spent bent on its root, and that the whole amount would not come to me as wages, not accident. Many students would read that part of the poem and think to themselves, I have no idea what that says and what that means. You know, that's really confusing. You know, I have no idea what to do now. I'm just going to give up. Instead, what you want to do is think to yourself, what does that probably mean? What is your best guess as for what that means? Because chances are, if you are reading this, if you're understanding most of the words, you can make a pretty good summary of it regardless. I suppose the tree kept some account of the hands that pruned, of summers I had spent bound to root. So basically it's saying here that this guy, he assumed that the tree basically had a memory of people who were pruning it, of like taking the dead branches off, of like doing good stuff to it. And that the whole amount would come to me as wages. So it's wages. That's something like money, something good. So he's basically assuming that he would get a reward for the fact that he was pruning and doing good stuff to the tree. That's basically what it's saying. And now I know that may have been like a much simpler idea than what it looks like, but that's what is actually being said. And then we look here, it did not. So this is not the case. You know, it's not giving a reward. Still the branches, black and thin, are stalked with all they mean to give in spring. The tree owes nothing. Okay, so the tree does not care. The tree does not care how good you were to it. It just is living its life here. It has no memory of anything. It has only wind. Okay, so it's just the wind. You know, like the people say, like it's just the wind. It must have just been the wind. Yeah. I made a debtor of a blameless thing. Okay, so the tree does not owe you anything. It's just a tree. It's just a tree, bro. So which choice best describes the overall structure of the text? For my prediction here, I'd probably say something like, this guy, he saw an apple fall from a tree, and then he thought that it like was indication that he was going to get a big reward, but he was incorrect. So then I'll look at this one here. The speaker describes a missed harvest, recalls the effort that he once invested, and then resolves to tend it differently in the coming spring. The big problem here is he says tended differently. There was nothing here saying that he's going to act differently when it comes to the spring. It's not like he's like, okay, now I'm going to just like be terrible to the trees, because it doesn't matter how good I am to the trees. Like they don't care anyway. So I might as well just like completely destroy the tree. You know, who cares? He doesn't say anything like that. So it would not be correct to say that he's planning to tend it differently. So it would be wrong. B, the speaker weighs two competing explanations for the trees. Okay, so first of all, not anything about two competing explanations. So that would automatically be incorrect. C, the speaker presents an observation, discloses an expectation that the observation frustrates, and then locates the source of that expectation in himself rather than in the tree. Okay, so yeah, that exactly is right. So, observation discloses the expectation. He thought that he was going to be getting a reward, but then he says that it is the source was himself, not the tree, because he said, yeah, I made a debtor of a blameless thing. He's taking he's taking responsibility for assuming something that wasn't exactly true. So C is probably right. Then D, the speaker recounts a routine harvest, notes an unusual detail, and then explains why that detail is typical. Okay, so yeah, nothing about being typical of the season, nothing about that, so D would be wrong. C is right here. So you can see here, even with a very confusing passage, it still is often the case you can just use the majority of the words to make sense of what is going on. Now, before we carry on, I want to show you this problem type called command of evidence. This is not one of the bigger categories of problems like we've been showing so far in this video. Rather, this is just one of the types of passage questions that you will see on the SAT. And I specifically want to point out this one because there are some things with this that make it a little bit different from some of the other passage questions you'll see on the SAT. And it's just really important to specifically think about this. Plus, some of them even look different. We have some down here that are like with graphs and tables and stuff. You definitely have to be prepared for that as well. Okay, so the big thing you should know heading into this is that command of evidence questions involve evidence. You probably could have guessed that, but yeah, these are basically questions on the SAT that involve more science-related concepts or basically anything involving data or a study. You may have done some research in school. You've been really lucky to actually do a research study, or at least you probably understand what research is. Basically, it's when you use kinds of different, technical methods, like maybe observing animals or doing something with bacteria or I'm explaining this really badly, but if you do different kinds of methodologies to learn more just about the world, like how different phenomena work, you might analyze how effective a new medicine is, or you might analyze how effective, a certain psychological principle is by doing some experiment with participants. So stuff like that is what evidence would refer to. And so with the SAT, these will appear maybe a couple of times on each module at most. And the things that you're going to notice with them is that they are just more complex passages. That's probably going to be the biggest thing. These are stuff with more weird words being used, more weird overall conceptual ideas being explained. And so you're going to have to be prepared to acknowledge that this is going to be a lot more complicated than the other stuff you've seen. And so I wanted to specifically highlight what I talked about earlier, which is the thing of note taking. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you should always take notes on command of evidence questions. That's not an absolute requirement. In fact, I really recommend not doing it on every single one because you should probably try to save time on the SAT. But for some of these, it can be useful to take notes specifically because these are going to be things where they're going to be explaining some kind of cause and effect thing a lot of the time. For example, they might say, if you're talking about in medicine, that if you take medicine X, they found that people got cured from disease Y. Their disease Y just went down as a result of medicine X. And so it can be useful to write notes like this exact thing. Maybe you could say X, arrow, Y, down. Like I said before, notes should not be complicated at all. They should actually be so bare simple that it may not even be clear what you actually are writing. And so you can write stuff like this if you're analyzing some kind of other effect. Let's say you look at humans, you're trying to do a psychological study and you're trying to see, okay, will humans associate angry faces with less intelligent people? Well, that's just a random thing off the top of my head. You might say that, okay, this is going to maybe a bad analogy, but AF, angry face, equals, this means less intelligent, we could say. You could also say, if you're trying to analyze something about money, how happy people when they have money, you could say money and then arrow equals happiness. You could say that money makes people more happy. So stuff like that is what you might want to do. So let me go through some of these. And for these first few, these are just going to be ones without any kinds of visual element to them. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the specifics you should do when you get to the visual ones. Besides that, I'm going to use just the exact same process that we went over earlier in this video of first of all, reading the passage while summarizing each thing, making a prediction, and then looking at the choices and seeing which one best matches up. So let me do that. Education historian Alana Rivers studied the early public messaging of several newly founded land-grant colleges in the US. So this person analyzed how these colleges basically spoke to the public. Rivers compared trustees' meeting notes with the college's printed circulars and course catalogs. So she analyzed a bunch of different stuff involving these colleges. She notes that some materials emphasized training in agriculture and engineering for the industrial classes, while other materials from the same years highlighted courses in rhetoric and classical languages and described the colleges as offering a liberal education. So some of them are trying to focus on the fact that these are just good skills to get a job, basically, agriculture, engineering. Other ones who want to focus more on the fact that it's like a classical education, like, stuff reading like Aristotle, philosophers like that kind of stuff. Rivers concluded that the college's founders intentionally paired practical goals with traditional collegiate markers, adjusting the emphasis depending on the audience in order to attract both political approval and private financial support. So what they're trying to say here is that these colleges, they were doing this on purpose, basically. They wanted to attract people who want to learn stuff like agriculture and engineering, but they also wanted to attract people who wanted maybe a more liberal education. So that is the goal here. And so it says here, which finding of true and most strongly support Rivers' conclusion? This is another small difference with these command evidence ones, where they're going to often ask you questions like these, like which thing would support this thing. And so with these questions, it's harder to make a prediction for sure, because you have to actually read this to know what they're even going to say in the first place. But my recommendation is that you should still try to make some kind of prediction. It's not going to be a good prediction. It's probably not even going to be at all what the answer is going to be, but it's good to make a prediction just because it's going to essentially strengthen in your mind what was written in the thing. So by making a prediction, you just understand better what the passage said in the first place. So I would guess that's going to say something like maybe they discovered that some colleges gave this certain pamphlet on agriculture, and some colleges gave this certain pamphlet on, or the same college, gave this certain pamphlet on stuff like philosophy, and they gave the same pamphlet at the same time to just two separate people. So that's something that could work. Now we look at these choices, and the thing that you should also keep in mind with this is that a lot of times when they ask questions like this is a little bit less like we said before, where you're trying to eliminate each wrong choice, and a bit more like a sliding scale. They ask here, which most strongly supports the conclusion? And so you're kind of thinking to yourself, there are going to be some choices that are really not at all in the direction of the conclusion, so maybe more down here. And then there are going to be some choices that are a bit more, and then a bit more, and then finally going to find one that's the best and most in the direction of the thing. And so we're going to see some choices that are kind of like this here, that are like on the fence, like they kind of are in the direction of supporting it, but not entirely. We are actually trying to find what would just literally be the best thing. So this is a bit different from what I've said earlier in this video about how you're not just trying to find the best possible choice. Keep in mind, this is a somewhat big difference with these kinds of questions. So archival records show that a trustee committee prepared two nearly simultaneous prospectuses, one mailed to state legislators highlighting farm experience and mechanical training, and other sent to wealthy donors emphasizing Latin, rhetoric, and cultivated student life. That seems very strong. If I was to say what direction it would be in, probably more along these lines, because it does say pretty much exactly what I expected. They sent one thing to one person, one thing to another, and just had different goals, basically. So pretty strong one there. I'll read the rest just to see if we can find a better one. Printer correspondence shows that the liberal education wording in early catalogs was copied from an older college's template, and trustees approved only the agriculture engineering sections before printing. This would really not be in the direction at all. It's kind of more like in this area here, because this would basically be implying that they had no intention of sending these double things, and they just were copying something that was already given to them before. So if I'm choosing between A and B, B is definitely worse. I'll just go ahead and eliminate it, because A is definitely going to win out in any situation. In 1864, a college circulated a pamphlet stressing farm and mechanical training. But after a new facility was hired in 1870, a revised catalog stressing classics was mailed to students, legislators, and donors alike. This is a bit better, but it still doesn't go for what you're trying to find with conclusion. You're trying to say that they specifically did this on purpose just because they're trying to appeal to different groups of people, not that they just suddenly had a classical education midway through. So definitely still a little bit worse than A, so I would say not it. D, trustee files include separate solicitation letters to legislators and to donors, but both letters focus on securing state funds for laboratories and make no mention of rhetoric, Latin, or other classical studies. Well, it was feeling really good in the first half. It kind of has in the first half, not gonna lie, but they didn't say here they had no mention of these things. That's literally the exact opposite. Like, they say here that there was mentions. That would definitely not be in the right direction. So D is not it, and then we go for A here. Moving on to this next one. So many language learning platforms present short videos with optional on-screen captions. So stuff like Duolingo, they show videos and you can turn on the captions if you want. So these linguists analyze usage data from adult learners in an intermediate online English course to examine learners' resilience on captions, changes in listening confidence over the course, and participation in optional live conversation sessions. Now, I'm not going to try to memorize what each of those three things are. I'm just going to know that they analyze different, small things based around this. Because learners chose whether to turn captions on, Voss and Kim could not determine from their data whether captions cause any particular outcome. Okay, so I'm actually going to write a note down for this one. I think this is kind of important and might be kind of hard to visualize. So they don't know if the captions cause anything. So I would say, like, here, I guess I'll say R for result. So they do not cause any result. Like, I'm going to draw an X between that. We can't say that the captions cause anything to happen. However, they propose that frequent caption use could reduce participation in live conversation sessions through an indirect effect. By encouraging learners to read rather than listen closely, heavy caption reliance might slow growth in listening confidence, and lower listening confidence might in turn make listeners less willing to join live conversations. So this is really where the errors are going to be very helpful. So captions, they don't hurt their results directly, but they cause a decrease in, I'll say, listening confidence. So I'll say this goes down when you use it. And so that then causes a decrease in the, I'll say, LIV for live conversations. And then that basically causes the results. So hopefully you can see the line of data here. We're saying that this causes that, which causes that, and that causes the result. We're not saying that the C causes the result immediately. So that's the big distinction for there. For my prediction for this one, I would say, trying to say which would most directly support the indirect effect. Probably just if they found something like, the people who use these captions, they do not feel as strong in their listening abilities, and they just don't decide to talk to people as much, like something like that. So let's look at the choices now. Listeners who relied heavily on captions showed smaller increases in listening confidence than other learners, but listening confidence was not a significant predictor of participation in live conversation sessions. So really bad last part here. This would basically be saying that these listening confidence has no relation to live thing, which would basically destroy the entire thing we're saying here. So sure, trying to find the best one here, but I'm just going to go ahead and say this is not going to be it. Like, I feel like we're not going to have to go for that one. Learners who relied heavily on captions showed smaller increases in listening confidence than other learners, and listening confidence was a strong positive predictor of participation in live conversation sessions. That seems a lot better, yet smaller increases, so it doesn't increase listening confidence as much, and that makes people less likely to go to the live things. Also draw like a down arrow for that, and that causes the result there. So B is probably going to be it. C, learners who relied heavily on captions showed larger increase in listening confidence. Okay, so I just know automatically, like larger increase in listening confidence. That's not what we're saying here, so we just know C is not going to be it. D, learners who relied heavily on captions showed smaller increase in listening confidence than the learners, and participation in live conversation sessions was a strong positive predictor of later listening confidence. This is better, but it's definitely kind of like weird. It's kind of in the opposite direction. We're trying to say here that the captions cause the listening confidence to go down, which causes the live participation to go down. This is basically saying here that they listening confidence, so it causes listening confidence, and then they're just saying in an unrelated note, the decrease in this causes a decrease in that. So saying like this causes a decrease in that. We can see here we're not getting to the result. We're just saying here this causes that and that causes that. We need something here that says that this also causes the end result of not being as good at learning the language. So this is close, but definitely not it again, so I go for B here. You're probably noticing as I'm going through this that yes, like I told you, this is a bit more complicated than the other stuff we saw here. So keep in mind the note-taking is a great strategy for helping with this, and you also have to make sure you're really solid at the other stuff we've already gone over in this video. Okay, now we're moving on to the visual ones here. For these questions, you're going to see stuff here like graphs, tables, charts, and you're going to have to evaluate this along with everything else you're seeing. Here's my thought process on this. The process for these questions is fairly close to what we were doing before. You still start by reading over the passage, and then you're still going to have to make a prediction and go through the choices. The one difference here is I'm going to add another just small step in the middle of this, which is step 2, the new step 2. You just briefly scan over the graph, table, or chart and identify what the independent and dependent variable are in their overall relationship. When I say independent and dependent, you don't need a science degree to understand what that means. All you need to know is that an independent variable is what is causing some kind of change, and a dependent variable is the one being changed. For example, if there are several people with a certain disease, I talked about that in an example up here, say they all have disease Y. I could give them a certain medicine, let's call it medicine X, to try to help cure the disease Y. The independent variable would be the medicine, because that's the new thing we're bringing in to try to change something. The dependent variable would be how well they feel. Like, do they feel good? Do they have the thing cured? Or do they feel bad? And do they still have the disease? So that is the result. So basically, it's kind of like the independent variable is what you're changing. The dependent is the result, or, what happens because of it. So you just have to identify that. You do not have to perfectly understand every single minute detail about the graph or the visual. That is way too much stuff that you have to analyze right away, and that would just take way too much time, and that's how students can very easily get confused. Instead, just understand those two factors and basically how they result. Like, does the independent variable cause the dependent to increase? Does it cause a decrease? Whatever. And then finally, make a prediction still. So still like make a basic prediction for what is being said here, and just look at the choices and see which one best matches both the graph and your prediction. Like the other ones, the choices might just be in the right direction. They might not be entirely wrong for whatever reason, so you have to keep that in mind. Now, I want to specifically say here that I used to give a slightly different strategy for these questions. I used to recommend that people just not even look at the graph table or chart at all and just immediately go to the choices. After thinking about it a bit more and seeing the results from a lot of different students, I have kind of changed my mind on this and decided I think it actually is better just to like briefly scan over the thing. So keep that in mind if you've ever seen one of my past things where I've talked about this and if I ever say something like that. Okay, that being said, we have this here for this stuff. And so let me go ahead and solve this question. So a team of sociolinguists investigated how listeners judge a speaker's competence when the speaker uses features associated with a regional dialect. So they want to analyze how competent listeners think a speaker is when they use a certain dialect, basically. The researchers recorded the same speaker reading the same short script 4 times. The recordings differed only in how many different regional dialect features the speaker used. So yeah, the only difference between how they were hearing it was how many different features, like how many different like regional dialect words that were being used. Each listener heard one recording and rated the speaker's competence on a scale from 1 to 7. So least competent to most competent. The listener said how competent they thought the speaker was after hearing what they said. Listeners also reported whether they were familiar with the dialect, for example, because they had grown up in the region where it's common. So one person might be from the actual area where the dialect is spoken, and that may affect how competent they think the person is. The researchers conclude that the dialect features lowered competence ratings primarily among listeners unfamiliar with the dialect. That makes sense as well if you really understand it. It's like if you are like, I'm from the United States. I mean, I guess it's not really dialect, but let's say I hear someone speak with a Southern accent. I'm not from the Deep South. I don't speak in a Southern accent myself. I regularly hear people in Southern accents. I may naturally think that they're like maybe less smart, honestly, just because I'm not used to that way of talking. Meanwhile, if you're from the South, you probably have no real difference at all in how you associate someone with a Southern accent. You probably just think it's like a normal thing. Meanwhile, if somebody heard my accent and just like how I talk and they're not familiar with me, they might also think that I'm less confident just because they're not familiar with how I am talking. So that's kind of the way this could work. So we look at this here. Dialect features, average competence. Okay, so as you increase the amount of dialect features, the average competence goes down, especially with the unfamiliar people. So that makes sense. Making a prediction, which best describes data from the graph that supports the research conclusion. Okay, so it's going to just say here that it decreased faster when it was unfamiliar than for a familiar one. Looking at the choices now, as the number of dialect features increased, competence ratings fell for both familiar and unfamiliar listeners. Okay, so not for really both. They're trying to focus specifically on the unfamiliar ones, so that would definitely not be it. B, as the number of dialect features increased, unfamiliar listeners' competence ratings dropped sharply, while familiar listeners' ratings stayed nearly the same. Okay, that seems pretty strong here. Probably it's going to be B. Okay, so C, familiar listeners rated the speaker as more competent than unfamiliar listeners at every feature level, indicating that familiarity consistently mattered more than the number of dialect features used. This is close to good, but first of all, it focuses more on the familiar than the unfamiliar. You kind of want to talk more about the unfamiliar because that's specifically what they're trying to focus on here, like listeners unfamiliar with dialect. In addition to that, this just says here that the familiarity is more important than the number of dialect features. We're not saying anything here about it being more important. We're saying that both of them matter, but specifically the unfamiliarity that's really causing people to decrease. Still, there's some kind of difference in the number of dialect features. That still plays somewhat of a role. So I would say for those reasons, C just doesn't seem as good, so probably not C. D, at the highest number of dialect features, unfamiliar listeners rated the speaker much lower than familiar listeners, but at the lowest number, the two groups rated the speaker almost identically. So honestly, this seems pretty good. Like it's saying here the unfamiliar rated much lower. So yeah, that is the truth. Like as there's much lower being rated for the unfamiliar. But at the lowest number, it says here for the lowest number of dialects, the two groups rated the speaker almost identically, which also would be correct because they both are the exact same up here. So really between B and D, what would be the tiebreaker? Well, we're trying to just see which one is best supporting of the thing. Just like we've done before, just like the thing up here with the spectrum, it says that they want to show that it lowered the competence ratings and specifically among these people. So it's lower the more dialect features we have. While D is pretty good, I would say B better encapsulates what that goal is because it's saying that as it increased, it decreased for the unfamiliar and this stayed nearly the same. That shows a comparison. It shows that one is dropping and everything. This one just kind of has bits and pieces of that. So it says here that it was lowest at the highest point and that at the lowest point, these two groups are almost identical. But if you think about what this is saying, it's kind of like they're just talking about the beginning and end. They don't really say anything about the middle. It's like if you're reading a book and they just said the beginning part and the first chapter and then the last chapter, but just don't have any chapters in the middle. That would be a pretty bad book and not really exactly what we're trying to go for. B is better because it actually embodies the entire thing. It's saying as it increases, so throughout this entire thing, it shows that the unfamiliarity or the competence is decreasing as well. So that is why I would go for B here. We have another one here, going to do the exact same thing, and this one might be a little bit more complicated, but yeah, not going to be too bad. Because warm ocean water can add moisture to the atmosphere, climate scientists often examine how ocean temperature affects the intensity of extreme precipitation. So basically it's saying here that when the ocean water is really warm, it can basically add moisture to the sky, and that makes it rain more or something like that. So these colleagues used a climate model to compare thousands of river basins under one scenario with present-day sea surface temperatures, and another with sea surface temperatures uniformly warmer by 2 degrees. So basically just saying here that they take one ocean that's like the regular temperature and one ocean that's like 2 degrees warmer. They then categorized each basin by how the basin's annual maximum one-day rainfall changed. So how much did the amount of rain that they got in one day, for the highest amount, change based off it? So was there more maximum rain or less maximum rain? The team concluded that under the warmer ocean scenarios, the percentage of basins experiencing an increase of more than 10% in annual maximum one-day rainfall will be higher than under present-day conditions. So it's kind of confusing in the last part there, but basically it's just saying here that when it's more warm, when it's a warmer ocean, it's going to have more than a 10% increase, more increase in the rainfall than in a non-warm one, like in a colder one, basically. So looking at this one here, let me see what I can tell. So change in annual maximum rainfall. So this is how much it's changing. So does it decrease? Does it increase by this amount? Or is it more than 10% increase? And percentages of basins. So was there a larger percent of the basins they analyzed or a smaller percent? So we can see a lot higher for this one here out of all of them. And so, yeah, we can definitely see more than 10% increase was definitely the case more for the warmer oceans over here because we have such a big one. Which choice best describes data that supports Patel and colleagues' conclusion? I would definitely just say the fact that we have over a 70% increase, or 70% of them were having more than 10% increase for the warmer oceans there. Okay, A, under present-day ocean temperatures, about half of basins are in the decreased category. So yeah, that is correct. And under the warmer ocean scenario, only about 1/10 are, suggesting rainfall extremes tend to increase when oceans warm. Okay, so that seems okay, but it's focusing on this one down here for the decrease. It specifically says here about an increase of more than 10%, so we're not focusing on the decrease part, we really want to focus on this part over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and say A probably is not going to be it. B, under present-day ocean temperatures, just under 1/5 of basins show more than 10% increase in annual maximum one-day rainfall. Yes, less than 1/5 will be about 20%, so that. And then under the warmer ocean scenario, nearly 3/4 of basins. Okay, so yeah, that seems really good. Exactly what we're trying to look for this thing here, so probably B. C, under present-day ocean temperatures, about 30% of basins show more than 10% increase. So actually, yeah, that actually would just not be right, I think. Because yeah, it's less than 20%, not about 30%. So that would not be it. Then D, under the warmer ocean scenario, close to 90% of basins show some increase. Okay, it's also not close to 90%. It's like close to 80%. So definitely not the right number at all. So B would just have to be the right answer. So notice on some of these, there are just choices that they might give you that just literally are not supported. So pay attention to that. That's a very easy way just to say that one choice definitely cannot be it. You can also see stuff here with tables. Some researchers studying indigenous actors and filmmakers in the US have turned their attention to the early days of cinema, particularly the 1910s and 1920s, when people like these people were involved in one way or another with numerous films. So they want to look at like the 1910s and 1920s when different indigenous actors and filmmakers were involved with films. In fact, so many films and associated records for this era have been lost that accounts of those four figures' output should be taken as bare minimums rather than totals. It's entirely possible, for example, that they're talking about the amount of films that each of these people worked on. So if you're looking at this, not really as much of an independent variable. That definitely would not be the scientific term for it, but I can still kind of view it. So like we have basically an independent variable of each of these people. So these are the people who played a role in this. And then the dependent variables would be the years that they were active and then the amount of films they make. So overall, we can just see, okay, we have a bunch of different numbers here. I don't really know what any of the numbers mean, but that's okay, like, yeah, it's a lot for each of these, basically. Which choice most effectively uses data from the table to illustrate the claim that the film counts shown are bare minimums rather than totals? So we're trying to say here that these numbers are just the bare minimum. Like, in actuality, it could be way higher than what's shown there. This is just like the bare amount that they might be saying at the minimum. So it would have to say something along the lines of like, one of these people maybe made a lot more films or were in a lot more films than is shown here. For A, we have Dark Clouds credited with this many acting roles, and then Lillian St. Cyrs was 66. So not really answering the question there. Yes, that might be correct, but we're trying to say here that it's a bare minimum, not the full amount. So that's not really what's being said in A. B, because records from the era are incomplete, James Young Deere may have begun his film work earlier than 1909. That is close, but we're not trying to focus here on when they started their film work. We're trying to focus on how many films they made. So that would also not be it. C, Lillian St. Cyr may have acted in more than 66 films, and Edwin Carrere may have directed more than 58. Okay, that is exactly it. We're trying to say here that there's a bare minimum, so C is probably it. And then D, Edwin Carrere's credited in multiple capacities, actor, director, producer, and writer, showing that some film workers held more. Okay, yeah, definitely not what we're trying to look for. Not saying anything here about being a bare minimum, so C would definitely be right there. I also just want to briefly talk about cross-text connections. Unlike the other one, this has no real differences in the stuff I've already said here. I just want to point it out because these may look slightly different from the other passage questions you'll see on the test, but you approach them the exact same way. For cross-text connections problems, you'll see maybe about 2 at most, I would say, on an average module. And what happens in these questions is you have 2 different passages, and you're trying to note the relationship between those 2. So not anything about one specific one, just how they connect with each other. And so the goal with this is like before, you just read over the passage, try and summarize each thing, you make a prediction, and then you go for the choice, and you try to see which one is best and which one is actually supported. The only thing I might mention here is that you're really trying to think what is the relationship between the 2. So not really about the specific details of each, just how would they connect? Does the first one disagree with the second one? Does the second one give more support for the first one? Do they both agree on the exact same thing and just have kind of slightly different viewpoints? Which thing is it? So let me do that exact thing for these questions here. A high school engineering club compared how well different liquids carry electricity using a simple circuit, a battery, a small light bulb, and 2 graphite rods dipped into a cup of liquid. So they're trying to see how well do liquids basically have electrical current that are passing through them. So we all know water conducts electricity, so probably I'm guessing it's going to be a useful thing for conducting electricity. In distilled water, the bulb barely glowed. In salt water, it glowed brightly. So if you have distilled water, there's not really that much of an improvement from using that. In salt water, though, it really does improve it. It makes it glow very bright. The club concluded that adding salt creates free electrons in the water, making salt water conduct essentially like a metal wire. So if you know chemistry, or even if you don't, you can just know that you have this thing salt, and that may have the potential to make it so these things can be better conducted, more electricity can pass through them because salt has electrical properties or something like that. The club proposed using tubes of salt water as inexpensive, flexible wiring for temporary projects. So yeah, if the salt is good, you can just use salt as a way to conduct electricity. A physics teacher noted that dissolving salt in water usually increases conductivity, but not because the water has become metal-like. So it's not that this thing, the salt is making the water become like metal. In salt water, the moving charges are typically dissolved particles with positive and negative charge, not free electrons roaming as they do in metal. So, this is getting kind of scientific here, but let's just try to break it down to what is really being said. So the moving charges have positive and negative charge. They're not just random electrons. So you can just know electrons is one thing. They are not electrons for what's being done here. The teacher also warned that when current passes through a solution, chemical changes at the electrodes can occur, and the resistance of salt water remains much higher than that of a metal wire. So resistance of salt water is much different from metal wire. So basically just saying here that the water is not at all like what is happening in a wire. It's not the exact same. A brighter bulb can indicate more current, but without careful measurements and controls, it is risky to draw broad conclusions about how material conducts. Okay, so basically what we're just trying to say here is that there are differences between the 2 things. For the prediction here, how would text 2 most likely respond to the club's conclusion? Yeah, pretty much just that exact thing. They would say that's a good conclusion, but just that there are differences between the 2. So looking at the choices here, a brighter bulb suggests higher conductivity, so salt water could probably work as a cheap, flexible wiring for short-term, low-voltage classroom demonstrations. So that seems good, but we're trying to say some kind of disagreement between the 2. This would just be agreement, so probably not that. B, dissolved salt adds ions that carry charge, but that doesn't make salt water metal-like or a realistic substitute for a wire with much lower resistance. So that seems pretty good. It's saying here there's a difference between the 2. C, the brighter glow likely comes mainly from electrochemical reactions by adding energy, so the test doesn't really show that salt water connects better than distilled water. So it doesn't really say anything about electrochemical reactions, I think. Yeah, I don't think I see anything here. It mentions electrodes, but nothing about that specifically being the reason why. So probably not C, because there's just not any support here in the passage. D, because ions carry charge, salt water can conduct with controls to reduce electrode reactions, can perform similarly to metal wire. So yeah, this would be saying here that it is similar. That's not what we're trying to go for. We're trying to go for that there's a difference. So probably it's going to have to be B here. One more real quick one here. Let me read this. In the algorithmic city, Dana Liu offers a lively account of how municipal governments use data tools to manage traffic, policing, and public services. So this person is analyzing how the government uses this data to manage these different things. Yet Lu's case studies are almost entirely drawn from a handful of US and Western European cities. So she's not looking at all the different cities in the world, she's just looking at US and Western European ones. The narrow focus quietly encourages readers to treat the political trade-offs Lu describes, especially the tension between efficiency and surveillance, as if they were universal features of smart city governance. So there are some features that are just for US and Western European cities. She's trying to treat them, she makes readers try to treat them as if they're just a feature of all, like, quote, smart cities, basically. A broader set of examples would have complicated that impression. So yeah, they should have used stuff from other countries rather than just US and Western European countries. Okay, Dana Lu's The Algorithmic City is at strongest when it juxtaposes experiments from cities with very different resources and political systems. So yeah, kind of like a similar idea here, that they're trying to say that it's best when they show things from very different cities with different kind of like circumstances. Still, Lu presents her material toward a single conclusion, that public-facing dashboards will by themselves make city administration more accountable. So it has this one clear conclusion that if you have these dashboards, it's going to make the administration more accountable. The book's own reporting suggests a messier reality in which transparency initiatives can just as easily produce confusion or indifference as meaningful oversight. So this one's also saying that the study or the book was like kind of bad, but saying it for a different reason. Saying it's bad because it tries to give this very clear, clean-cut idea out of a conclusion, but in actuality, the data had much of a messier, more like confusing, complicated way of looking at things. So for the thing here, which choice describes the difference in how the authors of text 1 and text 2 view the thing? I would just say text 1 really wants to focus on the fact that there wasn't enough data, not enough variety. Text 2 wants to focus on the fact that, I guess maybe you can even say that there's too much variety. Like there's so much different messy data that they can't really make one solid conclusion. Okay, so author 1 of text 1 argues that Lu exaggerates the benefits of transparency tools. Actually, nothing there about exaggerating the benefits. That's specifically, they're just trying to focus on the variety, so not A at all, I would say. B, that author text 1 argues that the book's evidence is too thin to support any general claims. So too thin evidence, I don't think it says anything about them being too thin or like not enough evidence, at least in text 1 and not even text 2 either. So yeah, probably not. The author text 2 book's evidence supports optimism. Oh yeah, nothing about supporting the optimism either, so B or not B it. C, the author of text 1 suggests the book is too pessimistic about data-driven governance. Okay, nothing about pessimism, nothing about it being very bad, so C is also not going to be it. Probably going to be D here, but let's just check. The author of text 1 faults the book for drawing too limited a set of examples. Yep, exactly right. While the author of text 2 faults the book for claiming a stronger political effect than its evidence supports. So it's going to be D for this one. So there you go. Those were 2 extra question types you will see on the SAT that you should definitely just be aware of heading into this. Up next here, we have grammar. This is going to be about the next 5 or so questions on the test after the passage questions, and here's that now. In this video, we're about to cover everything involving grammar on the SAT. Every single question type, every single topic, all of it will be covered in this video specifically. The first one here is boundaries. This is anything involving punctuation on the test. This is going to be the longest one of the video for sure, but you're going to be going through pretty much something that will be over 50% of the questions you're going to see in the grammar section. So this is going to be really, really valuable. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do punctuation questions in the grammar section of the SAT. Let me start by telling you a quick story. So I had a student back before the December SAT, and he came to me back in like November, pretty soon before the test. So not as much time as I wish I would have had with him. But basically what he told me is that he was getting above 700 scores in the reading section. And so I was like, okay, wow, amazing. So you already are scoring very, very high in the SAT reading section. And so I asked him, which questions are you still struggling with though? Because I was expecting him to say something like passage questions, maybe student notes questions if he's really unlucky, vocab questions. But no, he said grammar questions was his biggest weakness in the entire reading and writing section. And I was like, what? Like, how is that your biggest weakness? How is that the thing holding you back from a higher score? And so I remember I literally had a session with him, a 1-hour tutoring call, where I just went through basically every single thing in SAT grammar. And we had a few more calls as well, but it was the kind of thing where I was just showing him things and just immediately, as soon as he was seeing them, or pretty much immediately, he was changing how he was approaching these problems, and he went from having no idea how to do them to basically being perfect in SAT grammar. And then by the time he took the test, he actually got a 780 in the reading section. So really good job for him. He did amazing on the test in the end. He was definitely able to get past the grammar stuff. But what I'm trying to say with this is grammar is generally the thing where you can go from absolutely knowing nothing to being really, really good at it practically overnight. So pay attention as close as you can to this video because it genuinely may change everything for you. And I know this stuff works because it works for everybody who actually uses it and applies it. Now, the first thing you really have to know is that grammar on the SAT, a lot of people think it's kind of like this vague, confusing mess of stuff. They think they just look at grammar questions and they just have to choose whatever answer feels the best, whatever answer sounds the best in their mind. And the issue with this is, for students who are really, really good at grammar naturally, this will work. But if you aren't at that level, if you aren't like getting every single grammar question right, you're probably one of the people for whom this strategy does not work. And instead, you have to approach grammar a bit more like you approach, may sound a little bit weird, but math. Because when you do a math question on the SAT, you can't just rely on vibes. You can't just rely on what sounds right or what feels right. You have to actually approach it systematically. 1 + 1 must equal 2. It doesn't just equal whatever sounds the best. There's clear formulas, there's clear strategies, there's clear concepts, and that's how you do a math question. And in grammar, even though it may not seem like it, that's the same thing. There are logical, reasonable ways why grammar in the English language works the way it does. And if you learn these things, these questions can actually be extremely easy because you can just look at the sentence, think, does it have these certain things? And then if it does, answer must be this. If it doesn't, the answer must be this. So the first thing with that, the first systematic way you should look at these is with independent clauses. Independent clauses is, put simply, a clause, meaning a group of words in a sentence that can exist entirely on its own. You can just have it and then have a period right after it because you don't need anything else for it to fully be fine. But what does that I really mean? Because I can say that forever, but many people don't get what that actually means when you look at a sentence. Like, what does a sentence have to actually include to be a full thought? Well, first it has to have a subject. A subject is the thing doing the action. If I write a sentence like, let's say, John goes to the store, John would, of course, just be the subject for that. Pretty simple. It's just the thing doing the action. If it has no subject, you just know automatically not an independent clause. Then it has to have a main verb. In a general sense, a main verb is the main action of the sentence. So in this sentence, of course, John goes to the store, the main action is just goes. That's what is happening. That's the verb, etc. But if we want to be a bit more specific, it also is a verb that does not begin with to, it does not begin with that, and it does not end in ing. If it has any of those, then it automatically is not a main verb. So if I was to write a word like running, that would not be a main verb. If I was to write a verb like to run, also not a main verb. That runs, not a main verb. But if I just put runs, yes, that would be a main verb. So those two main things. First, it has to be the main action, and second, it can't fall into any of those categories. So in a sentence like this, the student who didn't study failed the SAT. What would be the main verb here? Well, the main action of the sentence is failed. That's what happened to the student. The student failed, that was really bad, etc. But we also have another verb here, which is study. But that's not the main verb of the sentence because that's just an extra piece of information you're adding. It's not the main action of the sentence. But the thing with independent clauses is it just has to contain a main verb. As long as there's just one main verb, then you're fine. It counts for the second rule. Third, the sentence cannot begin with a wasabi word. Wasabi words are words like while, when, since, after, all this stuff here. You'll get more used to what counts as a wasabi word as you do more of these sentences, so you don't need to memorize these immediately. You should just know that if it starts with one of these, immediately not an independent clause, dependent automatically. Nothing else really matters. Quick challenge for you, is this an independent clause? He runs. Now, a student who's going just off of vibes would probably be like, no, there's no way that could be an independent clause. But since you know this now, you would realize this actually is an independent clause because it has a subject, he, and has a main verb, runs. It also does not begin with any wasabi word. So that's literally how systematic this stuff is. It can be something that would never in a million years look like it would be the case, but if it just adheres to the rules, then it must be the case, just automatically. But here's why you actually need to know this stuff, because there are different ways to separate stuff based off of whether it's an independent or dependent clause. If you have two independent clauses right back to each other, you can either separate them with a period, just like end of the sentence, semicolon, or a comma followed by fanboys. Fanboys are the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. But really for the SAT, what you really need to know is the ones and but. Those are the ones that can be coming up the majority of the times. So these are really the only three ways, and it's really not much more complicated than that. Like, if you see any of the three things, you know it must be separating an independent clause and another independent clause. There's not really any exception to that. Except, I guess, complex lists, which I'll get to in a second, but that's really like a very uncommon thing. So not really many besides that. Then if you have an independent clause and dependent clause, it can be separated either with a comma. This is like 95% of the time just a comma, or nothing at all. So it could just be like, independent clause, and then dependent clause right after that. Other things you should know are colons, dashes, and parentheses. These can be used to separate either of the two. So it can be independent, independent, or independent and dependent. So don't need to really memorize these. I'm going to go over these a bit more in a second, but these are just some other good things to know. So look at this. The student who didn't study failed the SAT. That would be an independent clause because we have student, which is the subject, failed, the main verb, and no wasabi word. Then we have here, he didn't join mission 1400 plus. He is the subject, join is the main verb, no wasabi word. So we can separate this just with a period. We could also use a semicolon, or we could say so, because that would be comma plus a fanboy's word. You could also have something like this. Since the student didn't study, you notice since that is one of the wasabi words. So that's a dependent clause. And we have he failed the SAT. This would be an independent clause because we have he, then failed, and then no wasabi word in that one. So we can use a comma there to separate those two. If this doesn't fully make sense to you right now, no worries. You can definitely reference this as you do more questions, and naturally it'll start making more and more sense. Actually, probably by the time you finish watching this video, you'll kind of will have this thing fully internalized in your mind because you're going to be seeing so many more examples with this as I go through the rest of this stuff. So it's just going to kind of start coming together. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to talk about all the different situations in which you can use each individual punctuation on the SAT. So periods, commas, semicolons, all that. Because this is the basics that I've already covered, but now you need to know actually the use cases of them so you know whether what you're doing is a thing that you can do. First kind of punctuation we have is a period. As I've already said, literally the only time you can use this is to separate an independent clause and then another independent clause. Literally no other situation. So if we look at here, in 1969, computer scientist, actually, I'll skip the first sentence. Her code famously prevented a system overload during the Apollo 11 lunar descent. This was a moment that highlighted the value of error detection routines in early computing. Before the blank, we have her code, that would be the subject. Prevented is the main verb, and no wasabi word, so independent there. Then after we have this, which would be the subject, was, which would be the main verb, and no wasabi word either there. So since there's two independent clauses, we know it has to be one of those three separations that we specifically noted over here. And so therefore, the only one that matches that out of these choices would be B. That was easy, but now let's go over one that has a few more cases, the comma. This has 5 different situations in which you can use it. Thankfully, most of them are pretty easy to remember though. First thing you can use it for is a list. Lists are things where you essentially just have a group of different terms and you're just putting them all together. So I can say something here like John went to the store, the gas station, and his home. The 3 things here are the store, the gas station, and then his home. So we have to separate them with commas after each individual item. So in this sentence, the chef's signature tasting menu featured blank, pickled rhubarb, and a saffron-infused consommé that took 12 hours to prepare. Looks like we have 4 different items in this list because it can be more than 3. So therefore the answer must be B. We're just using commas to separate it, nothing else. It can't be the other ones because this one doesn't have a comma after this one, which you need to have if you're separating anything in the list. This one doesn't have a comma after the first one, and this one uses semicolons, which just is not how you use stuff in a list. Second thing you can use a comma for, as I said before, is comma plus fanboys. And keep in mind, this is only to separate 2 independent clauses again. That's literally the only case of to use comma in a fanboy after that. So if we look at here, the Voyager 1 spacecraft launched in 1977 and has now traveled beyond the heliopause. It continues to transmit data back to Earth more than 4 decades after its mission began. So the Voyager 1 spacecraft, that's the subject. This is one of the rare situations in which you would have 2 main verbs in here, both launched and traveled. The reason why is because you have and here. When you have and, you can use more than 1 main verb in a sentence. Beyond the heliopause, and it continues to transmit data back. In this second one here, we have here it, and then continues, and then no wasabi word again. So we have to use comma and fanboys, and we already have a comma here, so we can just use a fanboys word, which would just be and. We don't need another comma because you just don't need to use one after you have the fanboys word. Third thing is non-essential information. What non-essential information is information that, well, quite literally is not essential for the sentence. You can eliminate it from the sentence and it will still make grammatical and logical sense. Both of those are important, like not just sounds good, but also makes sense in your mind. So if you look at here, the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whose 2013 novel Americana won the National Book Critics Circle Award, has become one of the most influential voices. So whose 2013 novel, this thing is actually not important for the sentence to make sense. If I literally just eliminate that from the sentence, we can just say the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi has become one of the most influential voices. That makes sense, like it's logical, I still get what's being said there. So therefore, we can put a comma both before and after it to make it non-essential information. So the answer here can just be B. But let's look at this one here. In her latest study, evolutionary biologist Hoppy Hoekstra examines how deer, mice in the sandhills, etc. Shout out to my computer for literally deleting the second half of the video the first time I recorded it. It's fine. I'll just re-record it again. Totally didn't ruin my entire day or anything. But anyways, back to this problem. So if we think about it for a second, if we get rid of Hoppy Hoekstra from the text, it just says, in her latest study, evolutionary biologist examines how deer, mice in the sandhills developed whatever. It's just saying evolutionary biologist. We have no idea which evolutionary biologist we're talking about here. It could be me, it could be, I don't know, Steve Jobs, it could be Bill Gates, like, it could just be some random person off the street. We have no idea. So the sentence doesn't logically make sense anymore now that we deleted those words. So therefore, this actually would not be non-essential information. It would actually be essential information because we need the name to understand what's being said here. So we're going to have to actually go for D for the right answer. We also do not have another comma after Hoppy Hoekstra, so it also just can't be non-essential information regardless because you need a comma both before and after. A good rule of thumb is whenever you know the person they're referring to, it typically is non-essential information because you don't need that information to understand who we're talking about. But if you don't know who the person is, then it's probably not non-essential information because that information probably is really important to understand the person. For example, this one over here, it says here Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. We already know the exact person who is writing this book. So therefore we can eliminate this second part and we still know who we're talking about because we know this person's exact name. Therefore, that can be non-essential information because you don't need that extra information to identify the person. Now let's look at this one. The painting blank, Frida Kahlo, completed in 1939, has been the subject of this debate. So first of all, if we use the rule from before, if we get rid of everything after the blank because there's no other comma in the sentence, yeah, that doesn't really make much sense. The painting, that's not a complete sentence. That's just a subject, no verbs there. But also you can just kind of know that whenever you have that being used, typically it is not non-essential information. When you see the word that, typically it actually is essential information for the text. That's just kind of something that typically happens in English. So therefore A is going to be the right answer here. All right, just two more left for commas. The first one of the two is introductory information. This is basically just a repeat of what I said over here about independent clauses and dependent clauses. Essentially, you might see a sentence where it starts with a dependent clause, or if it ends with a dependent clause, you have to use a comma to separate both the independent and dependent. In this one here, after analyzing soil samples collected from 3 continents over a decade, it begins with the word after, and that is a wasabi word, so therefore this first part would be a dependent clause. But then you can see here, the team of geochemists concluded. So we have a subject, the team of geochemists, and then also a main verb, which is concluded. So this part here would be an independent clause. So we have to use a comma to separate them, which would be B. Now, technically, according to my rules here, you could also sometimes use just a straight up continuation. You can just use no punctuation to separate them, but 95% of the time it's going to be a comma to separate independent and dependent. It's really only rare cases, like if you have the word that, like I was saying before, that you would use no punctuation. So err on the side of commas versus no commas. Then the last thing here, which is pretty uncommon, but I decided to include it, is adjectives. Let's say if we have the sentence here, Mission 1400 Plus is an effective, fun way to study for the SAT. We have effective, comma, fun. We can do that because you could also theoretically write the sentence as effective and fun. Whenever that's the case, whenever you theoretically could use an and instead, you can replace that and with a comma. And speaking of which, if you do want to use Mission 1400 Plus to improve your score, check out the link in the description. It's one of the most fun ways to study for the SAT, plus you get my full math and reading courses. Now on to semicolons. There are really only 2 uses of this, so a lot simpler than commas. The first, as I've already said, is to separate an independent clause and another independent clause. I'm not going to give you another example because I've kind of talked about this already a bunch in this video, but yeah, 2 independent clauses, you can use a semicolon separated. But then the second thing is a little bit weirder, I'll be honest, which is complex lists. So I told you over here this idea of a regular list where you have multiple different items and you have to use commas to separate them. But what if in one of the items you have a comma already? So what if there's like a comma in this first item, a comma in the second one, and a comma in the third? You can't still use commas to separate them because then it's just going to get confusing. Like, is this an item? Is that an item? Like, which is the full item here? So instead you have to upgrade the outside commas to semicolons in this case. So just kind of a simple upgrade. So now you have a clear differentiation between what is part of the item and what is actually a separator. So for this here, we can see the exhibition featured works from 3 distinct cities: Lagos, Nigeria, Nairobi, Kenya, and Accra, Ghana. These are 3 different items because they're each city followed by the country that they're in, but we of course have to use a comma to separate the city and the country. So therefore, B is going to be the right answer here because it has a semicolon on the outside to be the bigger separator, but also Lagos, Nigeria for the smaller separator on the inside. It can't be these other ones because none of them have a semicolon. And also a really good way to know if it's complex list is if you see a semicolon followed by the word and in the passage. If you see that, it's definitely 100% going to be a complex list because there's nothing else in the English language, at least to my knowledge, that involves a semicolon followed by the word and. Onto colons. The thing you should know about colons on the SAT is they're not too complicated, but if you see one as an answer choice, there's a very high likelihood it's actually going to be right. I'm not saying 100% of the time, probably not even like 90% of the time, but like a majority of the time it's going to end up being right. Just because the SAT writers like to use this kind of weird, lesser known punctuations as correct answers. So if you're down between like a colon and a comma and you have no other way to determine between them, honestly choose colon over comma, which might not be what you expect. You might expect me to say comma because they're so common, but it's the exact opposite. The only time you use a colon is for what I call an extension. Basically, this is when you have a sentence and then the part after the colon is like a elaboration or a essentially continuation of what was said before. Here's an example of that. Marine biologist Edith Witter has dedicated her career to studying one of the ocean's most elusive phenomena, bioluminescence. So the phenomena that she's talking about is the bioluminescence. It's basically, that's what we're referring to here. And then it says what that actually would be. Therefore, A is going to be the right answer. We have phenomena and then an extension of what that phenomena actually is. It would not be the comma in this case because if there is any kind of extension, you just automatically go for colon over comma, kind of like I was saying before. It's not really a complex thing. We have to decide, okay, is this enough of an extension to make it a colon? No, the SAT is not really trying to trick you here. If there is some kind of extension, just go for the colon as the choice. The microbiologist findings challenge a decades-old assumption. Certain extremophiles can in fact survive in certain environments. Okay, so same thing here. We have assumption and then they explain what that assumption is. So we're going to have to go for D for the answer. Real quick, I just want to talk about question marks. I could skip this, but honestly, there's a maybe 2% chance you see this on the next SAT, and then somebody's going to leave a comment and be mad at me and everything. So I just want to really quickly talk about it. A question mark is only used if you are, you guessed it, asking a question. I know it's kind of simple, but the way you know if it is a question is if it begins with one of these unique question words like which, why, how, do, any of that stuff. It has to begin with it as the first word in the sentence for it to be asking a question. If it doesn't, they're not trying to trick you. It's just not a question, bro. So we have this one here. The team's central research question was straightforward. Which behavioral patterns help predict which species are most vulnerable to habitat loss? Which would be one of these words. The only time the question word doesn't literally have to be the first word is if you have a situation like this with a colon, where that basically splits off the sentence so you can start from scratch. If I rewrote the sentence like this, we would not use a question mark because which is just the random word in the middle of the sentence and there's no colon before it. So therefore, if it doesn't start with a question word, we just have to go for a period like usual. So onto dashes now. This may look kind of hard, but it's actually just a continuation of stuff I've already said in this video. It's just another punctuation mark you can use for the same things. First is non-essential information. So just the same thing I said before, if you can get rid of the information and have it still make full grammatical and logical sense, you can use a dash. You just have to make sure to have a dash both before and after the non-essential information. So in this one here, the man's shrimp's eyes contain 16 types of photoreceptors, 4 times as many as the human eye. We can get rid of 4 times as many as the human eye, so therefore it's non-essential information. B would be the right answer. The second thing you can use a dash for is the exact same thing as a colon, which is an extension. So in a sentence like this one here, astronomers studying the early universe have identified one consistent pattern, galaxies the first billion years. So the pattern they're talking about is the galaxies. Therefore, we could use a colon or a dash like this. And we don't have a colon as a choice, so we have to choose a dash. I don't think there's really ever going to be a situation where we have both a colon and a dash as the choice, so just rely on this. But I guess if you did have one, you would probably want to choose a colon because it's a little bit of a cleaner choice, but dashes work the exact same way. Now, real quick before I end this video, I just want to talk about a few other random punctuation examples that sometimes do confuse students that I should mention real quick. This first thing here is whenever you have a transition word in the choice. So this word, however, that is typically what you see in the transition section of the SAT, but it can appear here as well. When you see something like this, you have to just follow this exact format. Essentially, what's going to be the case is you're going to have this sentence at the beginning. You're going to have one full sentence with a period at the end. Then you're going to have two parts of the following sentence. The first part is before the semicolon. The second part is after the semicolon. Now, what you have to think to yourself, if the first sentence contradicts with the first half of the second sentence, then you put the however before the semicolon. But if the first part of the second sentence contradicts with the second part of the second sentence, then you put the however after the semicolon. Now, this probably makes no sense seeing this. Let me give you an actual example. Quantum computing is an interesting new technology. Quantum computers can theoretically solve certain problems exponentially faster than classical computers. However, they remain extraordinarily difficult to build. So thinking about it here, the part that's contradicting is this part here, which is that they can solve certain problems faster, and then the part that they say they're still difficult to build. Because we're basically saying here, quantum computers are really good, they can do stuff really, really well, but there's still some really big problems with them, like they're really hard, really expensive to build. So therefore it's B contradicting with C, so we have to put however after the semicolon, like for choice A. But if we have one here, internet culture has been around for decades. Skibbity Riz is different, however. The world in the 1990s never could expect the destruction that Skibbity Riz and his followers have caused. The contradiction here is between this idea that it's been around for decades and then this idea here that's now different. They literally say the word different, so it's a contradiction. It's something contrary to what you would expect. So in this situation, A would be contradicting with B instead. And so in that case, you have to put the however before the semicolon, just like I do in this one here, however, then semicolon. But you have to make sure that you understand this still follows the typical SAT independent dependent clause rules that I've already gone over. So if we have something like this channel, however, will make it very simple. You have to think to yourself, is there an independent clause both before and after the however? And there would not be. This channel, that is not an independent clause. There's no verb there. And we'll make it very simple. That's also not an independent clause because it's only a verb. It has no subject. So therefore, we cannot use a semicolon at all to separate these two. It just would not work. Instead, we just have to use regular commas, and we have this just be non-essential information like we've talked about before. The only reason these work the way they do is because they have an independent clause both before and also after the semicolon. So therefore, we can use a semicolon as the punctuation. Whenever you see an SAT punctuation question, you should solve it like this. First, just take a quick glance at the choices they give you to determine what you're really working with. Are they mainly semicolons, periods, colons, whatever? Then go back to the passage and figure out which is an independent clause and which is a dependent clause. With that alone, you probably will be able to eliminate maybe one or two, or maybe even all three of the choices immediately. If you cannot eliminate three wrong answers, then go and use the rest of the stuff that is discussed about the different punctuations to figure out what the answer must be. So for example, in this one that I showed before, I would look at this here. I see we have periods and commas and that kind of stuff. I look at this, we see we have an independent clause both before and after. Therefore, I know it can't be A, it can't be C, and it can't be D, so B must be the right answer. But then for this one here, I would see, okay, we have a colon as one of the choices. I go back to the passage and I see, so studying the words elusive phenomena, bioluminescence. So we have independent clauses before and then a dependent clause after. So we know it can't be D, so it could be A, B, or C. So now I have to go to the other rules. And I know that colons are always used for extensions. So therefore we should go for A for the answer. It's even better than a comma. Next, onto verbs. This is around 30% of the questions you're going to see on the test. It's also one of the hardest things to decipher with SAT grammar, but this should make it a lot simpler. So one of the most complicated parts of the SAT grammar section is the verb questions. They make up a pretty decent part of the grammar section of the test, and honestly, many students struggle a lot with this stuff. But the truth is they're not as bad as they seem. And so I was talking with a bunch of students in my paid community Mission 400 Plus who would tell me that they kept struggling with verb questions again and again. So I actually decided to make one of the calls in Mission 400 Plus completely based on verbs. What you're about to watch is that exact call. I'm pretty sure after watching this, you're going to fully understand how to actually approach SAT verb questions and everything that involves them. So definitely enjoy. You're going to get a lot of value of this, I'm pretty sure. And if you want to join Mission 400 Plus for yourself, check the link in the description. You'll be taken to this page. We have a 7-day free trial right now. And tonight is going to be actually a very, very important call because we're going to be focusing on specifically SAT verb questions. Now, if you're not familiar, on the SAT grammar section, about 30% of the questions you're going to see are going to be related to specifically verbs. And this is really difficult because this means you're likely to maybe see at least a couple verb questions on each SAT. And in addition to that, a lot of people kind of view verb questions like a board game where somebody else is making the rules. You feel like you master verbs, but then suddenly you get a question wrong, and then you realize that there's some completely separate thing that you did not even know about that caused you to get that question wrong. Just like if you've ever watched a sitcom before, or I guess you could experience this in real life as well. If you're playing a board game and you don't know the rules going into it, so you just have somebody else teaching you the rules, and it feels like you try doing a bunch of different things, but every time the person just like, no, you can't do that because of this rule, or you're missing this thing, or you can't do it because of this thing. And so it's like you feel like you're just at the whim of whatever person is supposedly telling you the rules of the game. And so that's how verb questions often feel. Probably a lot of you can relate to that. But in actuality, verb questions are a lot more like math. There's actually a pretty clear format and I guess formula for every single verb question you're going to see on the test. And if you're following the exact things, you can actually have a very high chance of getting every single verb question correct. It's not some kind of rocket science thing. It's not based off of vibes alone. It's something where you can genuinely learn the process and stop getting these questions wrong. That's what I'm about to do in this video. I think you're all going to really gain a lot from this. And probably after watching this video, you'll understand verb questions very, very well. Okay, the first thing I need to go over is the difference between a noun and a verb. Now, if you are at least somewhat familiar with English and grammar, this is probably extremely basic for you. But for those of you who are going to this completely blind with no experience, this actually might be something really important to analyze for a second. What nouns are anything that just is a thing, I could say. Not really the best way to explain it, but this probably makes sense to you if you really think about it. It's anything like a person, an object, an item. It could be a house, it could be a box. I am a noun. This computer is a noun. Soccer is a noun, or football is a noun. This keyboard is a noun. This mouse is a noun. Anything that just is an entity, you could say. So if you're like a picture of a person, picture of a flag, these are all nouns. Meanwhile, verbs are, of course, actions. They should be connected to nouns. Nouns should be the things doing the action, but they are basically things the nouns can do. So write, meet, eat, drink, choose, read, say. I can read, I can drink, I can eat, I can write, I can meet, I can choose, I can say. And anybody can do those things. So that's a core difference between those two things. And so this is going to deal with specifically the verbs and trying to figure out what format do you have to make these different verbs to match the nouns that are given to you. Because every single time you have a noun, there must always be a verb connected to it. That's actually the thing that makes a sentence, the fact that you have a noun and also a verb with it. If I say a sentence like I walk, that may seem like it's super basic, but that would be a sentence because you have a noun, I, and then a verb, which is walk. That's all you need. But if you don't have one of those things, if you just have the word I, that would not be a complete sentence. There are three categories of verbs that you need to understand before taking the SAT: count, tense, and main verb. The first thing is count. So think about it for a second. With a noun, let's say you have a noun like John. Now, John, there's only one of John, there's only one of me, so that would be a singular noun. Singular means that there's only one of that thing. Likewise, if I said a noun like mouse, this computer mouse, that would also be a singular noun. It's only one mouse. So you're always thinking to yourself, is there only one of that thing or are there multiple? If I said something like, let's say, okay, it's not a really good example here, but let's say I said doctors. That would be referring to multiple doctors. So that would be a plural noun. There are multiple things there. If I said friends, that would be multiple different friends. So that'd be plural as well. And the thing you're probably noticing is that for a lot of these words, the thing that makes them plural is the fact that we're adding an S at the end of it. So doctors, friends. Wouldn't work for mouse or John. Well, I guess we could say Johns, but mouse would be mice, but that's fine. Most of the time, it will be that. So you may think to yourself, for verbs, would it not be the exact same thing? If you add an S, it becomes plural. Well, unfortunately, it's the exact opposite, because here's the thing. Verbs are completely backwards from what I just described. If you add an S to a verb, that actually makes it singular rather than plural. So adding S to a noun makes it plural. Adding S to a verb makes it singular. And this works for pretty much every single verb you're going to see. Even these words like is, has, and was, these would all be verbs, and they're all singular because they each end in S. Meanwhile, these are, have, and were are all plural. And the thing is, you have to make sure that when you have a singular noun, it's matched to a singular verb. And likewise, if you have a plural noun, it's matched to a plural verb. So if I have a sentence here, like doctors, if I say something like the doctor's walking, I'd have to say the doctors walk, because walk would be the plural verb. Meanwhile, if I said friends, it would also be friends walk. It would be weird if I was to say friends walks. That just sounds wrong if you know English, but also it would grammatically be incorrect because that's not the right form of the verb. So singular, S, plural, no S. Look at some examples here. Walks and walk. For this one here, walks would be the singular one, S there. Walk would be plural. Is playing in play. This shows a very important thing, which is that you only look at the first verb being given in any of these scenarios. So always you just look at the first thing. That's going to apply for pretty much every single rule shown throughout this. So keep that in mind. Is does end in S, so that would be singular. Meanwhile, play has no S in it at all, so that'd be plural. This is another weird example, the word focus. You got to keep in mind that there are exceptions to this rule. I'm saying a very simplistic way of looking at grammar. There aren't a huge amount of exceptions, but there are exceptions. So for example, focus, you have an S already at the end of the word. So this would just end up being the plural one. And if you had ES to the end, it would now become the singular one. So keep that in mind. If it already has an S, you have to make it ES rather than just regular S. Are walking and is walking, pretty simple. Is has S, so singular. Are has no S, or plural. Speak, S, and then plural. So pretty simple there. And as I said before, we always have to make sure that you're matching up the right noun to the right verb. So let's get some examples here. A field guide to urban birds is designed for beginners. The guide blank clear photos and some other stuff it says. Okay, so the guide, that would be a singular thing. It does not end in S, and we can also just think to yourself there's only one guide that's really talking about. Looking at these ones, which one could we pick? Literally the only one could be A, because that's the only one that is a also singular verb, S. It ends in S. This one here, in Liza Donnelly's 2019 booklet, Sketches on a Train, each drawing blank broken line. So drawing, again, that would be a singular thing. Drawing does something. So we have to find a singular verb. Out of these ones we see here, the only one that would be singular would again be A, because it is the only one that says uses. One big exception to this rule is if it ends in ED. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, how to evaluate these kinds of verbs. But basically, if it ends in ED, that could typically work for both singular and plural. So don't use that for this rule. So she was misspeaking when I said before used could be singular or plural. The answer ends up being A for a different reason, which I'll get to in a second. Some other notable exceptions, well, not exceptions, but just things you should know, is that if we have of in the subject, you look at the word before the word of when determining if it's singular or plural. The stream of Instagram Reels was addictive. The noun here would be stream. It would not be Instagram Reels because that part is after the word of. Stream was, yes, that'd be singular, so that makes sense. If you have the word and in the noun, though, it just automatically becomes plural. Just don't need to worry about anything else, automatically plural. Jack and Jill are, this would be a plural verb, both criminals. Neither nor, this is a very, very difficult thing. If you have not heard this before, you probably never would have figured it out on your own, I'll just be honest with you. Thankfully, it doesn't appear too often on the SAT, though, so it's not that bad. But when you have neither nor, you look at the thing that's after the nor. So completely ignore the thing neither, just look at after nor and use that subject. So the mayor, so that would be the subject here, mayor. Mayor singular, so we choose a singular verb like is. Okay. Pretty simple there. I went over the majority of everything. And just as another reminder, there are pretty much exceptions for every single thing I say in this video. I can't go into every single individual thing because the English language is so weird, so vast, that there are literally exceptions to everything I'm saying here. But I will say the stuff I'm saying here is something that will work almost every single time that you see it on the SAT. Like, it's very, very common. It's very unlikely you're going to see one of the few cases where it does not work. So there are exceptions, but don't worry too much about that, I would say. So count. Second thing is tense. You're probably pretty familiar with this. Basically, if I were to say a word like walk, a verb like walk, how do I know when it is happening? Is walking happening right now? Like, are you walking as I talk right now? Or would it be walking that happened in the past? Like, could it be walking that happened yesterday? Or could it be walking that happens in the future? Like, it's going to be you walking tomorrow. So that's what tense is all about. Thinking, when does the verb happen in terms of time? So you can write verbs differently depending on whether it's happening present tense, meaning right now, past tense, meaning, of course, in the past, or future tense, meaning, will happen again in the future, or will happen for the first time. You write the verbs differently depending on each thing. So for present tense verbs, typically it either ends in S or just ends in nothing. It's just exactly how the verb typically looks. For past tense verbs, I don't have an example here, but typically it would be ending in ED. But like I said, there are many different examples. This is one of the exceptions. Wrote is one that ends just in E. Then future, this one is something that is pretty standardized. There's not any exceptions to this one. Will write. Actually, I won't say there's no exceptions. Maybe there's one that I don't know because, again, I don't want to say anything absolute here. But will write typically begins with the word will. That's the big indicator of future tense. So the big way to tell which one of these it is just by the signal words that you see in the text. When you go through an SAT verb question, it's going to hopefully, it will definitely say some stuff on when the verb is happening. Like if they say today, it's probably a present tense verb. If they say yesterday, it's probably a past tense verb. If they say tomorrow, next week, it's probably a future tense verb. So pay attention to these things because this is really the only way to determine this. This does not have anything to do with the nouns like we did for this one. It is just based off of the words shown there. A big thing I should mention is that there are many, many subcategories of different verb tenses that you can see. So I mentioned there are three main ones, present, past, and future, but there are different like minor versions of this, like simple present, present progressive, present perfect progressive. And if you've taken Latin, you probably know more about what each of these mean, but you don't need to worry about that. Because the thing is, you really do not need to memorize this list for the SAT. If you really want to be 100% perfect, I suppose you could. But I think for the vast majority of you, either you already are just familiar enough with the verbs that you don't need to memorize it, or you will not see enough different questions on these different things to justify having to memorize every single one. But I will just go ahead and point out a couple quick things here. I think the first one I really should point out here is this one specifically where it's, okay, present perfect. This is when you have something that started in the past and is now continuing on into the present. So if I said he has studied since June, he was studying in June, but now he's still studying in the current present. So that's what this verb is trying to say. He has studied, has followed by ed in the verb. Some other ones that I think are worth pointing out, I'm going to get to had in a second, but that deserves its own specific thing. Present progressive, this is also a very common one. This is where if you have like is, am, are, and then ing at the end. This basically just says that it's an action that is happening literally right now. Like it is literally current. I know that's what I said for most present verbs, but this is something that like literally is, the most present out of anything. Like it's happening literally as we talk. Regular simple present just means that it's something that is happening continuously. This is literally something like if I say they're studying now, like literally as we're speaking, they're studying. So that's a good one to know as well. The one I just mentioned before was this one had. This is a very, very important one. Basically what had means is that there was already another past tense action. There was an action that happened in the past. But then there's an action that happened also in the past, even before that action. So look at this example. Before the lecture started, my attention span had already been cooked. So we have ed here. So the lecture started in the past. Maybe it started like 5 minutes ago. But my attention span had already been cooked. That happened even before the lecture started. So like maybe it happened like 10 minutes ago. So both things happened in the past, but one was even further back than the other one, which makes it the had example. As I said over here, this is an example of past perfect. So keep this one in mind specifically. Here's some examples. During a 1977 expedition to the Galapagos, biologist, the person, wants to study their diving behavior. During a 1977 expedition, that happened in the past. So we know it's something that is automatically in the past. It's not something that's still continuing on into the future or connected to the future anyway. So therefore, we just have to go for tag, just regular past tense. Here's another example. Since it reads number of field recordings, along with this one here, it is just like something that happened in the past, like for sure. So we know that it can't be or, and also can't be this one, like there's no connection to the present here. It just literally is something about that happened in the past. So in this example, we would go for have reframed. It isn't had reframed because it's not saying that there's something happened in the past and something happened even before that. It is just regular past tense stuff. That is it for the tense stuff there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the main verb stuff. So in case you did not know, there's such a thing as a main verb. The best way I can think to describe it is basically it is the most direct verb listed in a sentence. So when you have a subject, there's one verb in the sentence that really is the clear action being taken by that subject. If you look at a sentence like this, during an expedition to the Galapagos, biologist tagged, the only big thing that's happening here is that she's tagging the iguanas. That's like, if we were trying to describe this sentence in one word, we would say tagged. We would not say any of this other stuff. We have the word study in here, but it would not be really fair to say that the main purpose of this sentence is she's studying. The main purpose of the sentence is the fact that she's tagging iguanas. So tagged would be the main verb. So hopefully you kind of see this is a little bit of a vague thing, like it's hard to fully understand this, but it's the direct action being taken. The big thing here is that every single sentence must have only one main verb. There are a couple exceptions to this. Yes, again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, only one main verb. So if you see an example here, the way you can think about it is if the sentence already has a main verb, I have to choose a non-main verb for the answer. And if the sentence does not have a main verb, then I do have to choose that main verb for the choice. If it doesn't make sense, just look at this here. If the main verb already exists, non-main verb. If no main verb exists, then you have to choose a main verb. Now, how do you know something is not a main verb? Well, like I said, it is not the most direct action of the sentence, but more specifically, one thing you can think about here is these three different exceptions. Okay, so three things that can never be a main verb are if it ends in ing, if it starts with to, and if it starts with that. So if you ever see these, you know automatically not a main verb. So you know if you're trying to choose a non-main verb choice, you can pick one of these different things. Pretty simple, that's like only the rules here. So I'll go through just a couple of quick examples. Their practice of labeling each specimen and their habit of stacking related specimens together in baskets, examples that, okay. So we're thinking here, is there already a main verb listed in this sentence? So we have here stacking, but that ends in ing, so automatically not a main verb. Labeling, same thing here. What other verbs do we have? We do have preserve. So that one does look like a good candidate. Been ruined. That seems fine, but it's not the main action of the sentence. All this said, here we have help as the thing in each of the choices. I would say here that the main action that's happening here is help. We're saying help preserve. We're not just saying preserve. So help would be the main verb. So therefore, we have to choose a main verb format for the answer choice. We can't choose a non-main verb thing. So if we look at these choices, helping ends in ing, so not a main verb, can't go for that one. That helped. That's one of the exceptions as well, so can't go for that one. To help, again, one of the exceptions. So therefore, we have to go for A for the answer. This is the only one that works as a main verb for the answer. So you just have to go for that. Next one down here, I'll just skip over this opening stuff. It doesn't really matter for grammar questions. This interpretation that each receptor simply reports the presence or absence of one odorant is too crude, she writes, because it ignores. Okay, so a bunch of different stuff in here, but let's look at this. So the interpretation of these sensors simply reports the presence. That may look like a main verb, but it's not really the main action of the sentence. This is kind of like just the introductory information, like the interpretation that each receptor simply reports the presence or absence. That's like just like a chunk of information there. I think writes would be the main verb because, yeah, that's the main action. Yeah, the fact that she is writing. So writes would be the main thing happening. Is would just also be a non-main verb. Ignores, the same receptor signal can vary with context. Again, a bunch of other verbs here, but I don't think any of these are as direct of an action as writes because this is connected to the subject. It is the core thing said in the sentence, and it's the overall action. So main verb, all this goes to say is that we have to choose a non-main verb as the answer choice. So looking at these ones, the only one we know for sure that is non-main verb would have to be A, because that's the only one that ends in ing. As I showed up here, the rules here, if it ends in ing, if it begins with to, and if it begins with that, it automatically cannot be a main verb no matter what. One more down here. In the museum's audio guide, a curator describes a series of preparatory sketches for a famous sculpture, the artistic choices. So looking at the verbs here, museum's audio guide, describes would be a verb. That shaped. Okay, that shaped automatically not because we have that. But yeah, so describes here. Describes would be the main verb of this thing because it's the key action of the sentence. We're saying curator, the thing that the curator does is describe. Yeah, so describes would be the main verb here. So we have to choose a non-main verb for the answer choice. Looking at these ones again, the only non-main verb one would be revealing because that ends in ing, so that would be the right answer here. One more thing I thought I'd just quickly mention. So with the main verbs, I mentioned there are some exceptions where you could have more than one main verb in the same sentence. One of them is when you have the word and. When you have the word and, you can just obviously have multiple main verbs because this is essentially a conjunction between different main verbs. So in this sense here, John both runs calls and tutors students in Mission 400+. Runs and tutors both act like main verbs. In this sentence, they're just joined by the word and. That's why you can have multiple ones in this sentence. That's just one quick example. So all these different things, 3 different rules for these verb questions. The way that you put this all together is basically as you go through different verb questions, you basically just eliminate choices based off of these 3 things. You look at what kind of nouns you're given, you look at the information given in the thing, you look at whether it already contains a main verb or not, and then using that information, you eliminate choices until you get down to what must be the right answer. So yeah, that's the main stuff here. A few other examples that has combined multiple of these rules. We can see here Quicksand, a novel whose shifting scenes and restless observations mirror the doubts. The thing here is that we have all this extra information. We have this non-essential information here, but the main subject of this thing would be quicksand. So keep that in mind. Whenever you have a bunch of information in commas, that is not necessary for your understanding of the verbs here. So quicksand, that would be a singular thing. So we're looking for a singular verb. So we know automatically are complicating, that would be plural. Complicated, that'd be plural. So yeah, also, I guess this one basically would be, basically remove it. So therefore, the answer would just have to be has. Actually, I don't know why I chose this one for thing because this one, yeah. Okay, yeah, that one's actually pretty simple. Yeah, quicksand has complicated scholars guide. Okay, let's go this way. I think this one has a little more complexity to it. This interpretation, and then we say, yeah, so interpretation, that would be a singular subject here. So we know that automatically going into this. So it could be suggests, it could also be has suggested, and it could also just be suggested, because as I mentioned before in this thing, and I mean, actually, it can even be suggesting, because all of these could theoretically work with thing. I think, yeah, I mentioned up here the ed thing and ing as well. It doesn't really fall into the main categories we listed before. So all these could work. The singular plural thing is not enough to figure out the answer. Okay, let's see what other information we could give in here. So interpretation, that the void thing, cautions, evidence. So it looks here like it's something that's happening in the present tense. I don't see anything that says it must be happening in the past. I don't see anything that says it must be happening in the future. So with that information, we know for sure that it can't be B at least. And I guess it could be D though, because that has some present elements here with the has. Okay, so can't be B here. Now, what other information we have? All we have left is the main verb thing. So we look at this one here. Behavioral ecologist, Amina Patel cautions. Cautions here would be the main verb. So we have to go for a non-main verb one for the answer. So we would have to go for suggesting. All those different rules kind of played a role in that one. And eventually we get to suggesting as being the right answer there. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Make sure to always stay Gucci. Now onto modifiers. This is less than 10% of questions you'll see on the test. You may not see a question like this at all on your next SAT, but if it does show up, you need to know the exact process because these questions can feel unbelievably difficult otherwise. So how do you actually solve SAT modifiers questions? When I say modifier question, this is referring to one of the grammar questions on the SAT. It's going to look a little bit like this. And basically, you know it's a modifier question because all of these choices are just extremely long. Like you may even think when you first see a question like this that maybe it's not a grammar question. Maybe it's actually a passage question or like a transitions question because these choices just seem way too long for it to be a grammar question. Truth is, it is actually very, very simple to solve these questions. And I'm going to show you why in a second. But the way I want you to think about these questions is kind of like a Rubik's Cube. So I'm not sure if you've seen anybody solve a Rubik's Cube like really fast before, like a competitive cuber. But you will probably notice that like they spend like a very, very short amount of time to solve this Rubik's Cube. Like maybe they spend like as much as like just 30 seconds trying to solve it. Maybe a little bit more if they have a little bit less experience, like maybe a minute or 2 minutes. But it's like, regardless, this is something that would take maybe me some like very, very long to solve. So the fact that they're able to solve it at all in a short time frame is just unbelievable. And so you probably have seen people before, or maybe you've been that person yourself who's just like look at somebody who does this and think to themselves, wow, you must be like some kind of genius. Like you must have like some thing in your brain that makes you unbelievably smart at solving Rubik's Cube, or just like you must have some supernatural ability that somehow is impossible to get by regular humans. But in actuality, these cubers, it's actually not that hard. Like they just learn some very specific algorithms that are used again and again. And so when they're solving the thing, sure, it takes a little bit of practice, but actually it's not too hard. And actually once they learn it, it becomes almost extremely easy for many of them. Maybe not extremely, but like at least somewhat easy. And so that's the same way I look at these modifiers questions. If you're a student who's going into them for the first time, they're going to feel very, very hard. And you're going to like think that you must be some kind of like superhuman to figure out how to solve these questions. Once you realize how to actually look at them though, you start realizing this actually might be one of the easiest questions in the entirety of the grammar section. The way you solve a modifiers question on the SAT is you have to look at the part that's right before the blank. So for this one, it would be revered for its luminous brushwork and haunting subjects. And you basically have to think to yourself, what is that part actually talking about? Like, what is the one thing or the one person that is talking about? And then you have to choose the choice that has that one thing or that one person at the beginning of the choice. So, revered for its luminous brushwork and haunting subjects. Think about what that's probably referring to. Brushwork, subjects, that probably is referring to like an actual painting. We're talking about some kind of painting here, and that should be the central focus of the first thing that comes after the blank. If the thing after the blank is something other than that, then we know it's not going to be the right answer. Art historians have long debated. Okay, so art historians are not revered for their luminous brushwork. We're not saying that we're painting historians. Like that's not what's happening. We're talking about paintings here, not people. James Whistler's series of nocturnes. Okay, so I know this has a lot of words to it, but yes, this actually would be the right answer because the nocturnes, that's just, I guess, another word for a painting. And basically that would be the thing that is revered for the brushwork and haunting subjects. That's the thing that we're talking about in this first part here, the nocturnes. So it is like a long subject, but it fundamentally is just that subject. If you look at this one, interpretations of the nocturnes, so that would not work because the interpretations, that's just like text you write. That's like maybe if somebody writes something down on a form or something online, that is what the interpretations would be referring to. Those things are not revered for luminous brushwork and haunting subjects. It is the paintings specifically that are. And finally, the legitimacy of art historical debates. If you understand what I'm talking about at this point, you should be able to clearly tell that would not be it either, because the legitimacy, that is not the thing that is revered for brushwork. So that is pretty much how you solve these problems. It does get maybe slightly more complicated than this, but overall it's pretty much exactly this thing. The important thing to always note is whenever you have the apostrophe S at the beginning of the choice, you know that you're not talking specifically about that thing. You're talking about whatever comes right after it. So if we just had James Whistler without anything else, we would be talking about the actual person, James Whistler, and that would be the thing that would have to be described here. But since we have the apostrophe S, that's why I go to series of nocturnes. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this. Okay, so looking at this one, we have this whole sentence here, but we don't need to really read that. So starting here, commissioned by the Farm Security Administration. So what would be commissioned by the Farm Security Administration? You may be kind of confused by that at first, but commissioned, that basically means the Farm Security Administration went to some person and they're like, hey, do this thing. Like, I guess they painted this thing, build this thing, write this thing, whatever. So we're talking about some kind of person here. There's some person who is commissioned by the Farm Security Administration. I guess if we're not sure who that is, we could just look at this previous sentence just to check. So Dorothy Lange. Okay, so we're probably going to be talking about Dorothy Lange. So Dorothy Lange is really who is going to have to be right at the beginning of the choice. Okay, the displaced farm workers. Okay, so even though maybe that could make sense, like maybe the Farm Security Administration went to displace farm workers, based off this previous sentence, it wouldn't make sense. Like we're talking about Dorothy Lange here, not displaced farm workers. So probably not. But actually, I mean, I'll go ahead and keep it actually. Like, yeah, maybe there's a chance I could be wrong on that. Her photographs. So this might be a little bit confusing, but we're not saying here that the photographs were commissioned. Again, it's talking about a person who the FSA went to and is like, hey, do this thing. So they didn't go up to a photograph and like say, hey, photograph, do something. Like they went up to a person who said that. So that would also be wrong. Lange's photographs. Okay, you may be confused on this because you do have Lange here, but we have the apostrophe S. Remember what I said for this one here? When you have the apostrophe S, you have to look at the thing right after it for the subject. So photographs, again, they're not going up to pictures and like yelling at them. So therefore Lange, okay, yeah. So commissioned by the thing, Lange, yeah, Lange is the person who they commissioned. So D would make the most sense. Now, one more thing that can happen, sometimes you have multiple different choices that are both saying the exact same thing at the beginning, and then you have to use other grammar rules to decide how it must end. So the difference between them is the ending of the choices. So if you look at this one, the footage showed that, okay, after screening the footage. So we're talking about people here again, people who watched some kind of footage. So yeah, the volunteers. Okay, the volunteers, that could work. The volunteers again. Okay, yes, that also could work. The university's curator. Okay, so honestly, the curator thing, I don't think, if I look at this one, you were talking about volunteers here. Yeah, we don't talk at all about the curator in the first part, so that probably just would not be it. Similar thing with the farm workers in this one. And then a newsreel. Okay, yeah, newsreels. I think that's referring to like a newspaper, basically. So a newspaper cannot be watching footage. That would not make sense. So between A and B here, so we would have to look at the end of it to determine this. So we see here prompting the courier to contact a regional museum, and then we have one with a comma and one without a comma. So if you know the other grammar rules, which I cover in another video on the channel, definitely check that out, you would have to use a comma because whenever we have ing in the verb right afterwards, you always must use a comma as the separation because this would be a dependent clause. So therefore, A would be the right answer. B is very close, but just this one thing with a comma makes it so it cannot be the right answer. Okay, this one. A German diplomatic note known as the Zimmergram telegram. Okay, so we're talking here just about the message, the Zimmerman telegram. So something that has to be the first thing that's said after the blank. United States. Okay, no, the United States is not a message. It's a country. The message is interception. Okay, that is close, but again, we have apostrophe S here. So interception. An interception would not be referring to the note itself. So that would also be wrong. The message. Okay, that's correct. The message again. So both of these could work. We have to look at the other stuff here again. So the message was intercepted in 1917, helping draw the United States into World War I. Yep, that grammatically makes sense. We have the comma, then ing, just like in this one. The message was intercepted in 1917 and helped draw the United States. Okay, so that would not work, again, because of the other grammar rules. We have here a dependent clause after the thing because we have no subject here, so dependent. But they're using an independent separation, comma, fanboys. So that would not work, not the right separation for the job, so therefore C must be right. One more one just to finish this off here. Framed by snow-capped mountains and fed by glacial streams. Okay, so we're looking at something that was given snow-capped mountains and glacial streams. I guess that's probably referring to like something in the environment or something. So what was framed by snow-capped mountains and glacial streams? High altitude wetlands? Yeah, that actually could work. Yeah, that makes sense. The valley's high altitude wetlands. Okay. Surprisingly, even though it looks a little bit weird, this also would work because again, apostrophe S, we look at the first thing afterwards and it's still high altitude wetlands. So that could work as well. The valley hosts high altitude wetlands. Okay, so I think based off of these two, we can probably guess that the valley is not the thing that's framed by snow-capped mountains. Yeah, I think we're probably talking about the wetlands specifically. So yeah, that's just kind of a guess on my part, but I think that probably would be correct. Hosting high altitude, okay, yeah, hosting, that would not be a good thing to be in. Okay, again, one more time, we have to look at the thing that's right after it. So we just have a main verb right after it, host, and so we can't use that in front of a main verb. If we use that, it becomes automatically not a main verb. Again, I talk about this in another section of this course, another video. So therefore, we're going to have to go for B for the right answer. That is really it for these. Like I told you, it's pretty much like a Rubik's Cube. If you know how to do it, it's a lot easier than if you don't. And if you do know how to do it, it's actually kind of extremely easy. So make sure to just keep following that process and should always be pretty simple. You should always be able to get these right, assuming you do so. On possession, like modifiers, this is less than 10% of what you'll see on the exam, but if it does show up, you again need to know this really well. How do you do possession questions on the SAT? Honestly, this is a somewhat niche topic in terms of SAT grammar, but it is something where if you don't know the thing, you're just going to get these questions wrong. And I can imagine a lot of students who maybe kind of know this topic who are, as a result, going to get many questions wrong when they see this on actual SATs. So you have to make sure you understand how this stuff works. So the thing with possession, basically what this is trying to show is this is a grammar concept on the SAT that shows that something owns something else. So for example, if you have a person and that person in their possession, well, okay, using the word in the sentence, but in their collection, I guess you could say, owns a certain book. Possession could be used for this person for that book. If this person's name is Lucas, we could say Lucas's book. If this person's name is Jeremy, we could say Jeremy's book. That would be showing possession. It could also be for a variety of different things. It could be something more intangible, like this person could be me with this YouTube channel. I could say John's YouTube channel. That's possession. We could also even just use it for traits. So for example, if you're talking about my love of brain rot or something like that, I could say John's love of brain rot is very weird. Something like that. So anything that could arguably be owned by something else. Another good way to think about it is if you could use the word of for it, that is also an indication of it being possession. So I could write the sentence here, the book of John. In that sense, I'm trying to say a book that is owned by John. We could also say John's book. Same kind of thing there. We could also say the YouTube channel of John. We could also just say John's YouTube channel. So you probably get what I'm saying here at this point. If you know English, this is probably just a very common thing for you. But the big thing is determining which one do we use. Many students just kind of pretend like this is a simple, easy thing, but it really is not, because apostrophe S or S apostrophe. You see many different examples with this thing, and many of them maybe are different from what you expect. But it's actually so much easier than you may realize, because here's how it works. You use this S and apostrophe whenever it is a possession question. So that's the first thing you know. Always got to be apostrophe and an S, but we don't know the order necessarily. Then the way you decide the order is you think to yourself, is it going to be singular or is it going to be plural? In case you don't know, singular means that there's only one of the thing. If I said something like John, there's only one John, so that's a singular thing. If I said the man, that's only one man, so that's a singular thing. Plural, on the other hand, is multiple different things. So if I said the people, or if I said the friends, or I said the nations, those are all multiple different things. They're not just one of each. And so in most cases, what happens is you use the apostrophe S when it's a singular thing and S apostrophe when it's a plural thing. You may not believe me that's actually this easy, but think about some examples. If I said John, that is only a singular thing, so that's why we use apostrophe S. Even though if I was to change this and make it a name that ends in S, so if I said Lucas, there's again only one Lucas, so we still use S apostrophe S. So still apostrophe S, even though it looks weird because we already have an S in the name, that's just how it works. Singular, we use that. If I was to say something like a friend, if there was only one friend, again, I would just use apostrophe and then S. So that's how it always works. And then for plural things, you can probably see as well how it makes sense. Let's say we have, I guess probably shouldn't erase that, multiple friends. So let's say it's like the show Friends from the 90s. You have friends. This is the regular version of the word. But in order to make it plural, we would just have to add an apostrophe after this S. So friends apostrophe. That is how it works. And that's why you don't have to add another thing, because it's already S and then apostrophe. So that is how it would work there. If we had some other name, I don't know, if we said like doctors, multiple doctors, again, multiple must be plural. So you do S and then apostrophe. So that's how it would work. Now, there is obviously a big exception to this, which is plural words that don't automatically end in S. So I say this as the basic rule, but you do have to note this one exception because this does show up a lot. So if I said something like people, that is multiple things that would be a plural word, but it does not end in S normally. So in that case, I actually go back to the regular singular version and just do apostrophe then S. Same thing, we're going to see an example in a second with women. Women does not end in S normally, so we have to use apostrophe then S for that. So this is the basic rule, but if it is a plural word that does not normally end in S, you go back to the singular one. That is really the main stuff you need to know. Let's do some practice problems here. Dr. Ray spent 3 years studying a single Bengal tiger in the reserve, and her field notes chronicle the tiger or something, hunting behavior across every season. So they said only one tiger, there's no S at the end, that's a singular thing, so we must use apostrophe and then S. So therefore, pretty simply, we just use B. It cannot be D because that would add another S in there. We don't already have an S in the word tiger. The scholarship committee reviewed all of the applicants' personal essays before selecting 3 finalists from the large applicant pool. So it basically tells us here there are multiple different applicants. There is not just one applicant in here. There already has an S, it already is plural, so we have to use S and then apostrophe. So we would just go for something like, this. C, S, and then apostrophe. Now, it gets a little bit weird when you talk about this thing, it's versus its, and then there versus there. Let me just go for this real quick. There and its are also just ways of showing possession. If I said their items, I would be saying basically the items of them. If I said its items, I would basically be saying the item of it. The only difference between these two is that there would be a plural one and its would be a singular one. So I could say its book, that's saying the book of it, their book, whatever. But when you have the apostrophe in here, these are entirely different words. They look similar, but they're completely different things. It's like if I was trying to take the SAT and then I see somebody talking about the LSAT. They look very, very similar, but you probably know that these are completely different tests. They are for completely different purposes. If you're taking the SAT, you should not be taking the LSAT. And if you're taking the LSAT, you should definitely not be taking the SAT, at least not at that point. So that is how this stuff works. There, with the apostrophe, that basically means they are. So I could say something like, they're sad. Basically, we're saying here, they are sad. That's just another way of writing it. Same thing for it's basically saying, it is sad is the same as saying it's sad. So that is how that works. So this is not possession at all. These are just completely different things that have nothing to do with this stuff here. So now let's go back to the example. Startup confirmed that blank releasing a redesigned app next month, a move intended to attract younger users. Is it showing possession in this sentence? Is anything owning something else? Well, not really. It's not saying that like the startup, like its money or its book or its item. It is saying it is. Therefore, according to the rules I said here, we have to just be using the apostrophe. So we'd go for its. The startup confirmed that it is releasing a redesigned app next month, a move intended to attract younger users. Next one here, a traveling museum exhibit on women contributions to early aviation features pioneers such as Bessie Coleman and Amelia Earhart. Here's that rule that I told you before. This is a plural word for sure, multiple different women, but it doesn't automatically end in S, so we have to go back to the regular singular thing, so B would be the answer. Note that's not D, because D actually changes the word up. It has the A in there instead of E. You have to have the E to make it plural. Last one here, marine biologists reported that the whale were migrating hundreds of miles farther north than usual this spring, likely in response to warmer currents. This is just another red herring of a question. There is no possession happening there. We're not saying that the whales own anything. It's not saying that the whales own their blubber or own their, I don't know, ocean or whatever. It's just saying whales. Whales were migrating. So therefore we have to go for A. If you finally on pronouns, this is another very niche thing, less than 10%, but it's very, very good to know. Let's talk about pronoun questions on the SAT. In case you're not familiar, what a pronoun actually is basically a shorter, smaller way to write a noun. So let's say we have John. John is a perfectly fine way to say John. I am John. If you're talking about John in a sentence, we could use the word John. But let's say we don't want to keep having to say John again and again, because if I do that, pretty much my sentences are all going to look like John went to the store, John did this, John did Y, John did X. We don't want to keep saying John because it just eventually starts feeling a little bit repetitive. So instead, we can start using pronouns as like a replacement for the nouns midway through what we're talking about. So for John, instead of just saying John every single time, I can start saying he. Makes a lot of sense. You're probably familiar with pronouns. If you have spoken English at all, I'm sure you're very, very familiar. That's how they work. Another way to think think about this is kind of like when you're signing up for something for the first time. When you first make a password for any kind of website, oftentimes they have this thing, remember me. It's really cumbersome if you have to write the whole password every single time you're trying to sign in. And many of us also just forget what our passwords even are in the first place. But it's easier if you click this remember me button, because now it just takes away all that effort and can automatically go in to whatever software you're using. That's kind of like what a pronoun is. And the thing with pronouns is you may just use pronouns like regularly, like whatever just feels right. You might say they, he, him, it. But on the SAT, there are actual specific rules for which pronouns to use at which points. And specifically, you have to consider the number, the gender, and the case of the pronoun being used. Okay, let me talk about each one of those real quick. Number refers to the amount of people. If I was to say John, that is only one person, so we have to use a singular pronoun like he, or if John was an object, we could say it, or if John was a girl, we could say she. If instead there were multiple people, like if we said something like friends, that is multiple different things, so we have to use a plural pronoun like they. So just keep that in mind, they versus he, she, it. Second thing is gender. On the SAT, they are strict with making sure that you follow the gender of the pronoun. So if you have John, something that is masculine, you would say something like he or him. If you have like Julia, which would be feminine, you would say something like she or her. The thing you should know is if you have something like an animal, like if you had a dog, you just call that it. I know you may want to like call it by, whether it's he or she or even call it they or something like that. But if it is an animal, the SAT just wants you to refer to it as basically an object. I know it's a little bit bad, but that's how the SAT works. Last thing here is the case. This one may not make as much sense as the others, but basically the way this works is you think to yourself, is the pronoun doing the action or is the pronoun receiving the action? Or theoretically, it could also be possessive. I'm going to show an example of this in a second, so let's just wait until that. Here are a couple examples. Antecedents are the nouns that the pronouns are in place of. So student, the student, you can say that. Then a pronoun could be he or she. And then the example would be the student forgot her book. The students, a pronoun for that would be they. And then the students forgot their books. So that kind of stuff here. As for that case thing I just mentioned, there are basically 3 different cases you can use for the SAT. If it is the subject, meaning the pronoun does the action, use something like I, he, she, we, they, who. So you could say she runs fast because she is the thing that's doing the running. If I said John goes to the store, we would say he goes to the store. If I had multiple friends and they all threw a big party, we could say they threw a big party. But if it's an objective pronoun, that means it is receiving the action. So this would be like if you had a sentence that said the teacher praised him. Him is what is receiving the praise. So therefore it would be in the objective case, him. So him, me, her, us, them, whom. So the teacher praised me, the teacher praised her, the teacher praised them. That's how this stuff would work. Then finally, possessive. I have a whole other video about specifically possession, but this can also work for pronouns. So if something owns something else, like if I own an object, if I own a mouse, if I own a keyboard, if I own a computer, that would require a possessive pronoun. So my, mine, your, yours, his, her, hers, our, ours, their, theirs. My book is very good. So just my book. I know this stuff is like super just like tedious, nitpicky, but it is important. If you see a question like this on the SAT, you are going to have to decipher between these and you could get a question wrong very easily if you don't. Now, some other just like kind of cringe, weird examples that you should know as well. If you have something combined with and, you automatically use the plural pronoun. So this would be a plural thing. Jack and Jill went up to the hill, they fell down. But if it is using or instead, then you can just use the singular pronouns and just combine or with them. So Jack or Jill would present his or her idea. So each of these would be singular, and we just use each one for Jack and Jill respectively. Now, another big thing that you have to keep out for is the nouns that they're using. This here says the team won its game. Its would be a singular pronoun. Meaning because there's only one team. Even though the team is made up of multiple different people, there's only one entity of the team. That's only one thing. Meanwhile, if we said here the team members celebrated their win, now that goes to being multiple because we have members here. You have to always think, what is the main thing actually doing the action? In this example, the team is the thing doing the winning. In this example, it is the members who are celebrating, and that is the action that they're doing here. So just good example, keep in mind. Now, I do just have to quickly mention, this is the last rule I'm going to do before I get into some practice problems. You have to know the difference between stuff like it's and there and there. I covered this again in the possession video, but I'm just going to do it again because it's so important. It's, what this means is literally it is. So basically it would be the pronoun it and then saying is. So I could say it is good, it is fun, it is happy. It's, on the other hand, without the apostrophe, would be showing possession. Watch my possession video if you want to see more on this, but basically it's showing that something owns something else. So if I said it's book, it's item, it's rock, that is possession. That is something that is owning those things. There, if that has an apostrophe, that means they are. They are happy, they are sad, pronoun, and then verb. This would also be possession, their, so their books, their objects. Your, same kind of thing, you are, and then your, which would just be possession. So keep that in mind. You are going to see some examples like this on the SAT many, many times, so you should understand this very, very well. Okay, let's do some practice problems now. Otherwise, the instrument can lose calibration, making its readings inconsistent. So the antecedent here is instrument. That would be a singular thing. It's just an object as well, so it doesn't have any gender. And so calibration, that's saying the instrument basically owns the calibration. It's the calibration of the instrument. So we have to use a possession thing, so it could work like it's. Singular and possessive. This setup allows each of the satellites to change orientation without firing thrusters, which would consume limited propellant. This is kind of a weird example, but we have each here. Each would be referring to a singular thing because it's saying each of the satellites. So basically every single individual one of the satellites. So that must be singular. Again, it is also possessive because it says orientation, basically the orientation of the satellite. So we have to use a possessive thing in singular, which would again be its. During deep sleep, the hippocampus reactivates patterns of neural firing from the day by coordinating with a cortex. Blank gradually stabilizes the patterns. Okay, the antecedent here is hippocampus. That would be a singular thing. It is not feminine or masculine, and it is just the subjective thing, so this time it would be it for the answer. All of these would involve something that's plural rather than singular. The city council invited the public to comment on plan to renovate the park. This one might be a little bit weird, but think to yourself, what is making the plan? Who is making the plan? It would be the council that is creating this plan. It would not be the people who are doing it. It's not the public who's doing it. So therefore, we have to use a singular pronoun yet again. And since the plan is basically owned by the council, we would use something like it's here. And just one more quick example. We have here one frustrated teacher wrote an email to the principal saying she considered distracting and completely unnecessary additions. So they're talking here about Subway Surfer clips, so that would be a plural thing this time. And also it's saying she considered blank distracting. So this time it would be the objective case. It would be the thing that is receiving the action from the principal. So therefore we have to go for something here that's both plural and objective. So that would be something like them. I'll be honest with you, I've worked with many SAT students. I don't think I've ever talked to a single one who actually was like seriously struggling with pronouns. So this is the kind of thing I think you generally can just master in the span of a day if you're watching this video and be really good at it after that, and then you'll just be solid. So just do a few problems on this and I'm sure you can get really good. And yep, that is it. That is all of grammar on the SAT. Next we have transitions. This is going to make up about 3 to 4 questions after grammar on the test, and here's that. So how do you actually solve SAT transition problems? Believe it or not, I genuinely believe that transition problems are some of the hardest reading questions you're going to see on the SAT. But thankfully, solving them is actually not too complicated. The process is pretty clear, and if you just follow it on every single question, sure, sometimes they'll be really hard, but most of the time you'll just be able to solve it fine without any problems. Now, here's the thing with transition questions. If you don't know, I do these live streams on this YouTube channel. And the thing we've been doing is doing SAT questions until I miss one. And it's always a lot of fun. It's always like really intense because every single time I do a question, I'm like, will this be the one that I mess up on and have the stream completely end because of it? And you definitely should check it out if you haven't before. But it's worth mentioning going into this that I believe at least 3 out of the 5 streams that I've done so far as the time I'm recording this, I lost on transition questions. The reason why I had to end the stream was from a transition question. And now this isn't because I'm terrible at transition questions. More so, it's just because transition questions on the SAT, at least for some of the really hard ones, are the kinds of things where really it's going to look like there are 2 answers that are both correct. So how you should think about this is learn the strategy for these questions, understand them as well as you can. But at the end of the day, it's the kind of thing where really you have to do a lot of practice to make sure you don't fall for some of these traps. And if you haven't done as much transition practice, you may struggle on some of these more complicated question types, just like I have done. But I mean, I typically get transition questions correct. I mean, I've got a 760 on the SAT reading section. I'm not often getting transition questions wrong. It just, sometimes they can be really difficult. Now, just as define a transition question is something that looks like this. You have 4 choices that are all of these different transition words, like however, likewise, consequently, and they typically appear after the grammar questions on the SAT. So about question 20 to 25 of the reading module, you're going to see these. It always kind of varies how many transition questions there actually are. There sometimes are a lot, sometimes there's only a couple, but there should always be at least one. The process for solving them is as follows. First, you read the passage. If you've seen some of the videos on this channel, I have this very specific way I recommend for reading passages on the SAT. And basically that is, you read each sentence And after you read the sentence, you basically summarize the sentence in your own words before moving on to the next sentence. And you have to do this every single time you read a sentence. Otherwise, you're probably going to get confused and the sentence is probably just going to get kind of jumbled up in your mind. So let me do this on this passage here. A neighborhood group predicted that replacing a four-way stop with a roundabout would reduce minor collisions at a busy intersection. So basically, instead of having like this four-way stop here, we're going to have a roundabout, and that's going to make it so there's less car crashes at this intersection. That's the summary for the first sentence. Blank, police reports found that the following year showed a slight increase in fender benders. Okay, so basically it was the exact opposite. They found there are more car crashes when they did stuff. So the exact opposite. And that brings me to step 2, which is you have to make a prediction for what you think the correct answer is going to be. So think in your mind, what kind of transition word would make sense to go in the blank between these two sentences? And you should do this even before you look at the choices, because here's what's often going to happen. If you look at the choices first, you're really going to get confused. You're really going to look at a word and think, oh, that looks like a great word for this sentence. In actuality, though, you may just be looking at a random word that's meant to trick you. You really should make a prediction on your own before even looking at the choices so you don't get tricked by these terrible choices that you end up seeing. I'm pretty sure at least one of the questions that I missed for these live streams, I missed because I skipped this step. So definitely do not do that. So I would guess that would be a word like however. However makes sense here because it's basically saying a contradiction. It's saying first this, but then this. So however is what I would guess here. And then finally, just look at the choices and just see which one matches. Now, this is probably the hardest part of the process for many people because you have to really make yourself not, go for a choice that just seems a little bit better in the moment if it's not what you predicted for the answer. This is often how you're going to mess up these questions when you just see a word and think, oh, that word seems like it could be a great idea, when in actuality, it just does not work. You're looking for the best possible transition, not just a word that theoretically could work. So in this example, we have however as a choice, so I can pretty easily just go for it and select that. Now, you may be asking yourself, how do you know all the different transition words that could theoretically show up? Well, I have this list here of these 8 different types of transition words that can appear on the SAT, 8 different categories. If you want this document, check the link in the description to join Mission 1400+. This is my full SAT Skool community. I have a 7-day free trial on it, and you can access this document in there for free. So, there's 8 different types. First is what we just did, contradiction. This is basically just when a sentence says something in the opposite, in a different direction from what you would have expected it to say. So I had a great day. Nonetheless, I lost millions of dollars. So, however, nevertheless, on the other hand, this is definitely the most common thing that you're going to likely see on the SAT because it just works so well. Contradiction, we see it everywhere. 2, cause and effect. This is pretty obvious as well. Basically, one sentence causes the other one to happen in terms of its logic. The sun was out today, therefore it was hot as frick. So these are words like thus, accordingly, hence. Then we have specification. This is a little bit more interesting, but basically it's just saying that the second sentence gives an example of the first sentence. Many animals have developed unique ways to survive the cold. For example, the Arctic fox has a thick multi-layered coat of fur and can lower its heart rate to conserve energy. So it talks about how these animals have found interesting ways to survive, and then it gives a specific example of an animal that has done so, the Arctic fox. Specifically, for example, to demonstrate that is restating. This is where it gets maybe a little more confusing, but all this is saying is that the second sentence just is another way of saying what the first sentence said. The company is letting you go. In other words, you're fired. You're fired is just another way of saying that they're letting you go. In other words, in conclusion. Emphasis. This is when the second sentence really wants you to focus in on one specific part of the first sentence. So it emphasizes something. He is a talented musician. Indeed, he can play any instrument he picks up. So it wants to make it seem like he's not just a talented musician, like he's an extremely talented musician. Like he can just pick up any random instrument and just immediately start playing it. Indeed, in fact. Sequencing. This is when one sentence just happens after the first sentence. First I chopped the vegetables, then I added them to the pot, then or afterward. Agreement. This is when the second sentence says something that just has a similar idea as the first sentence. So this may be a little bit weird when you first realize it. You probably understood the rest of these. Maybe this is the first one that seems a bit weird, but here's an example. Houseplants require much care and attention. Similarly, outdoor plants must be cared for properly. So you can see here, it's basically just saying 2 different ideas, but the second idea really goes along with what the first idea was saying. And you can probably just identify this when it happens, like similarly, likewise, those kinds of words. Then finally, we have another idea. This just adds another idea to the list of sentences. It does not necessarily agree with the first idea. It does not necessarily disagree with it. It's just giving another thought. We need to purchase the supplies for the event. In addition, we need to finalize the guest list. So it's just two separate things. They don't necessarily have any connection with each other. They're just two ideas. In addition, moreover, furthermore. Now, if you see a random transition word or phrase that you just do not know, a really good trick that you can use is this. Just pretend like you have a random sentence. Like, let's just say, mission 1400 plus is great for the SAT. And just put in that transition word that you're seeing as one of the choices. So a big one that may be confusing to you that I've seen before is the word fittingly. So what does fittingly mean? What does that transition word mean? What you should do is just put it in and just think to yourself, what would make sense for the sentence that comes after this? Mission 1400 plus is great for the SAT. Fittingly, it sounds kind of like positive. It sounds like, okay, something that, fits the first sentence. So fittingly, many students have improved their scores with it. That makes sense. Yeah, fittingly, that sounds right. So if I've never seen this word before, at least that seems like a good guess for what that can mean. Another word I really see a lot of students talk about is that said. So let's say we have that said in a sentence. Mission 1400 plus is great for the SAT. That said, so that seems like, different direction. Seems like it's something off. So it kind of maybe works like, however, that said, it doesn't work for everyone. Something like that. So yeah, that would definitely work. Furthermore, Mission 1400 plus is great for the SAT. Furthermore, it can help many students. Yeah, that sounds about right as well. Now, full disclosure, I did not come up with this technique myself. I learned this from James Liu, which is another SAT tutor on YouTube, but it just was such a good idea that I felt like I had to throw this in there because really, if you know anything about transition words or anything about English in general, this probably is going to help you whenever you see a weird one that you're not familiar with. So let me just quickly do a few more examples. And I'm just going to follow the exact same process that I already showed in this video. And the only thing that's going to change is that now maybe I'll use some of these things here that I discussed for like my prediction and for when I'm talking about the choices. Geese migrate thousands of miles between their summer breeding grounds and their winter habitats. Okay, so geese are traveling really far between where they are in the summer and where they are in the winter. Blank, scientists have long been fascinated by the bird's ability to navigate such vast distances without prior experiences. So the scientists think it's amazing how they can go all this way without, any kind of prior experience of doing it. They just are built with this ability. So if I had to make a prediction here, I probably would guess something maybe along the lines of emphasis. They're saying that there's some phenomenon, and then as a result, it's so amazing that, this is happening. Indeed, in fact. So something like that. So let's see, is there something like indeed here? For this reason, nevertheless, similarly, meanwhile. Honestly, there's not a word exactly like indeed here. When this happens, you just kind of go for the most similar word that is actually there. You may not always be able to find an exact match. Sometimes maybe your prediction may even be a little bit off. So for this reason, that seems like a good choice for here. It's maybe a slightly different category. It's more like cause and effect rather than emphasis, but they are pretty similar categories for sure, so it works. Next example. When a city launched a weekend ferry service to reduce traffic, some commentators predicted that ridership would drop sharply after the first summer. Okay, so they think that they have this new ferry service, and they think that the people who are riding it are going to decrease a lot after the first summer they do it. Blank ticket sales reports show that many riders continue using the ferry and total ridership increased over the next several years. Okay, so basically the exact opposite. They actually had more people on it in subsequent years. So definitely it seems like something like however. We're looking for something with a contradiction here. Looking at the choices here, the closest one of that is definitely in fact. In fact, it doesn't really seem exactly like a contradiction, but that is what it's saying, because they're saying that they thought this would happen, but in fact, in actuality, something different happened. Ecologists monitoring a restored wetland found that it reduced downstream nitrate levels by nearly half during spring storms. Okay, so they found that this wetland, it reduced the amount of nitrates that were in downstream, so in the lower part of the river, by half. Okay, so it just reduced the amount of nitrate that was in the river, basically. The city approved funding to restore 2 additional wetlands along the same river. Okay, so the city wanted to add more wetlands because I guess it was doing such a good job. So this definitely seems like a cause and effect type thing. We have this first sentence here that says it's really good, and the second was since it's so good, the city decided to do this. So we're definitely going to go for as a result here. Real quickly, I just want to show you one of the questions I actually missed in one of those live streams. This is a really good thing to see because this is probably one of the harder examples you can see for a transition question, and see if you can figure it out yourself. I was not able to the first time I saw it, so yeah. At a large public library, staff members tracked room reservations using separate spreadsheets, phone messages, and handwritten notes. Okay, so they had all these different ways of tracking who was in the rooms at different times. Patrons complained that bookings were difficult to confirm because the information was scattered across multiple systems. Okay, so since there are like so many different things, spreadsheets, phone messages, it's really confusing because there's just so much stuff they have to keep track of. Staff members, however, value the flexibility of the old system and worried that switching platforms would slow service. Okay, so the staff members did not want to change. They liked how it was, and they want to keep it that way. Blank, to address the patrons' complaints, in 2022, the library adopted a single online scheduling platform that centralized reservations and reduced double booking. Okay, so they're like, okay, bro, we'll do what you want us to do. We'll switch over to something else. That's fine. So what would be the prediction here? Now that I know what the correct answer is, my prediction definitely would be something like contradiction. However, nonetheless, because we first say here in this sentence that they don't want to change, and then the next sentence is literally like, okay, bro, we're actually going to change. Completely the opposite of what we just said. What I had messed up on in the live stream was I thought it was saying that since there's some people who do want it and some people who don't want it, ultimately they had this compromise where they did this thing. So I thought it was more like a therefore, thus thing. But it is not, because the thing right before it is saying this and then saying something completely in the other direction. So when you have a sentence that's right before that says something different, you should go for something that's just saying a contradiction just directly. So therefore, nevertheless is the answer. Comment below if you're able to figure that one out. On the more recent SATs as of June 2026, there have been some questions like this, where it's a transition question, but the choices are just really, really long. Thankfully, you solve these the exact same way as the other ones. It just looks a little bit different. It might be a little bit more difficult to figure out, but it just works the same way. And in many ways, it actually is a little bit easier actually though, because you have more information you can deal with. For a question like this, we only have like 4 words, or I guess 5 words to deal with. This, we have a ton of different words, so we really will know if one choice is wrong or if one choice is right. Let's solve this one. Researchers studying urban green spaces have found that parks and tree-lined streets can improve residents' mental health and reduce stress levels. Okay, so when you have stuff like parks and trees, people are feeling happier. They don't have as many mental health problems. However, some city planners argue that maintaining large public parks can be expensive and may divert funding from other infrastructure projects. Okay, so though it could have all these good things, people are like, it costs just so much money. Like, how can we get all these parks in when it just costs so much? Many cities are still debating how much land and funding should be devoted to public green spaces. Okay, so people are debating it. Some people think we should, some people think we shouldn't. So I think we just need something here saying like, okay, they're debating it. They're arguing about this thing. Maybe because of these things, as a result, they're arguing. Looking at the choices now, let's see the one that matches. So as a result, that part looks good, but let's see what follows it, because we have to look at the entire choice, not just the first part of it. All cities have reduced the number of public parks they maintain. Okay, so that wouldn't really make sense. It's not like all of them have just randomly found the amount of money that they need to do this. B, in addition, some parks contain walking trails and playgrounds. Okay, that doesn't really have anything to do with it. Consequently, balancing environmental benefits with economic concerns remains a challenge. Okay, so that definitely works. So it's saying here there's still this kind of debate. People are arguing about it, but some people agree, some people don't. If you just look at D real quick, by comparison, rural communities develop low property. Okay, that has nothing to do with what we just said. So definitely C would be the right answer here. Sometimes they're not as long though. Let's try this one. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists interpreted massive stone monuments built by ancient civilizations as primarily as demonstrations of political power intended to intimidate rival societies and reinforce elite authority. So like, I'm not sure if you've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, where you have that like big monolith that the monkeys are like playing with and stuff that they talk about for the entire movie, but that's kind of what I think of here. But basically they're saying that when you have those kinds of big, huge statues, it's trying to show power. It's trying to make people scared because they're so powerful, all that stuff. More recent scholarship has suggested that many of these structures also serve important religious, ceremonial, and astronomical functions within their communities. Okay, so contradiction here, we're saying that they weren't just for power, they're also because they had like important roles in the communities. So something like however is my prediction. Looking at the choices here, reinforcing the influence, okay, no, not reinforcing, it's like contradicting basically. Revising this narrow interpretation. Okay, that seems pretty good. Like revising, changing it. Let me just look at the rest of them. Depending on the accuracy of these records, okay, that doesn't really have anything to do with it. Illustrating the scale of these construction projects. Okay, it doesn't really talk about the scale at all. So B would be the right answer here. Finally, here we have student notes. This is going to be the last few questions on the test, about 3 or 4 at the very end of each module, and here's that here. So in this video, I'm going to cover everything you need to solve student notes questions on the SAT. Here's the thing about these student notes questions. They may seem like they're just something that appears at the end of every reading module, just some extra thing you have to do and just get it out of the way so you can finish the module. But in actuality, that's not the case at all. Actually, the thing with the student notes questions on the SAT is these are questions that are completely different from every other question on the reading and writing modules in terms of how you solve them. obviously how they're designed, and everything else about them. And if you're approaching these questions the same way you're approaching the other reading questions on the SAT, you're going to be doing them wrong, and your accuracy and timing is going to be a lot worse than it could be otherwise. So in this video, I'm going to cover exactly how to approach these questions and how to do them to maximize your chance of getting them right. So student notes questions, they of course look like this. You have notes on like the left side and then a question that's asking you about them. You should solve these questions using the following 3-step process. First, you read the question and try to see what it's actually asking for. And make sure you really understand what it's asking for as well. Don't just like read it and just like kind of understand it. Make sure you actually fully get it. Then check the choices and see which one actually achieves the goal for the question. So whatever it's asking you for in step 1, see which choice actually does that thing in step 2. Now, at this point, you can hopefully just select the answer and move on. But if it's an especially confusing or complicated question, or if the choices just don't make sense, or if they're really similar, or anything that just seems kind of off, you can then at that point look at the actual notes themselves and see if they can give you kind of any extra guidance, any extra information to solve the question. Now, if you've watched the other videos on the channel, you would know that this is completely different from every other question I've talked about so far, because typically what I always say is read the passage, then predict an answer, then select which one best matches the answer. This is different in that you don't actually have to read the passage first. This is really something you should never do on any other reading question on the SAT except for these. And the reason why you can do it on these is because the notes themselves typically don't have that important of information. Typically, it's going to be the case where you can just look at the question and there's really only going to be one of these choices that actually answers what the question is asking for. So you can just go for that one. But again, don't allow this to be something that you do on every single reading question. If you're doing this for other questions, you're going to be getting them wrong because you do need to be reading these stuff on the other question types for sure. So that's really it. Besides that, it just comes down to making sure you're familiar with these different question types and actually able to apply it. So let me go through a few examples so you can really understand this for a second. So first, let's identify what the goal of this question is. The student wants to write a sentence that both defines a seiche and briefly describes how it forms in large lakes. One really useful thing you can do at this step is try to actually rephrase what it's asking for in your mind. If you know from my other video, this is actually what I say to do for the passages in passage questions. And if you think about it, it's actually kind of a similar thing because it's like, in a way, this is the passage for a question like this because this is the thing that gives us the majority of the information we're basing our stuff off of. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, if I was trying to explain this in my own words, I would say we're trying to essentially explain what a seiche is, like say seiche is X. And then we also want to explain how it forms. So what actually happens in nature to make a seiche appear? Is it just something with like water? Does there have to be like some human involved? Whatever. What actually makes it form? Now for student notes questions, these questions can be asking for a bunch of different things. Here are some of the things that I commonly see in different student notes questions as for what they're asking for. So it could be like summarizing a research study, comparing two things, showing that one thing causes another, emphasizing when something happens, describing a methodology like for a research study. You could support a claim, just provide evidence for some statement, define a concept, kind of like what it's asking for on this one, or provide an example. So I'm not going to give you an example of literally all of these different things just because the only way to actually understand each of these is really by doing a question on them. You can't just memorize this different list of things and hope that's going to help you with the student notes questions. You have to really do questions, and by doing that, you're going to understand how to approach each of these different things. So back to this question now, we're looking in step 2 to see which one of these both defines the seiche and then explains how it forms. And once we find that thing, we can just select it and then we're done. Nothing really else we have to do there. One important thing for this process is you should really have it in your mind. You're trying to find the best answer choice for a question like this. Again, this is completely different from what I say for passage questions where you're just trying to find the least wrong answer. And so the difference between those two is that when you look through these choices, you're basically trying to think there may be several ones that are kind of okay, but which one really is the best? Which one really achieves the goal the best out of all 4 of the choices? And that's what's going to be your right answer. The period of a seiche varies with a lake's length, depth, and shape, making each lake's oscillation unique. So that does not define a seiche at all. And it also doesn't even really mention how it forms. So it doesn't really do either things here. So A would be wrong. If I was to try to eliminating some choices, I would definitely eliminate A. B, strong winds create waves and lakes that may slosh back and forth for hours, even days at a time. This might seem okay on the surface, but you might notice here it doesn't even mention a seiche at all. It doesn't even use that word at all. So it's just really bad there. Like if you don't even have the right terminology for a question like this, it's not really going to be the right answer ever. So I'd also eliminate B. C, water sometimes moves from one end of a lake to the other and back again. A motion scientists call a seiche if the lake is large enough. So this is actually a lot better. I'd say this probably does answer the defining a seiche part, so it does define it, but it doesn't really explain how it forms. It doesn't really say how this happened. It just says what it is. It doesn't really say how a seiche essentially is created or caused. So it could be okay, I'll leave it in there now, but probably not it. Then finally we have D. A sight is a standing wave in an enclosed or partially enclosed body of water that can be triggered in large lakes when strong winds push water toward one end. Okay, so that definitely does both things. It defines the sight. It says a sight is a standing wave. It also describes how it forms. It says it can be triggered when strong winds push water toward one end. So between C and D, D is definitely the right one. And as you'll notice here, I did not need to read the notes at all to answer this question. If I was to read the notes, it would just be wasting my time at that point because it doesn't have any useful information in there. Pause the video now and see if you can solve this question, and then I'll solve it for you as well. Okay, so step one, the student wants to highlight George Eastman's role in making photography more accessible. So we're trying to say here, how did George Eastman essentially make it so more people did photography? So this could look like maybe he made cameras more cheap, maybe he made more education available on photography, something like that, but something in terms of how he made it usable by more people essentially. So that's what we're looking for. Now we just look at the choices. So early photography relied on daguerreotypes, a process introduced in 1839. So again, similar thing as for B on this question, it doesn't even mention George Eastman at all. We really need to know what we're dealing with for this to be a correct answer, so A cannot be right. Daguerreotypes produce clear pictures but demanded lengthy exposure times. Same problem from A, we don't know what George Eastman did as a part of this. You don't know what his role would be in this, so not right. C, this looks a little bit better. George Eastman's 1888 Kodak camera, which used roll film, made photography affordable and accessible to amateurs. Okay, this looks pretty good here. We say George Eastman, what he did, which is make the Kodak camera, and it made photography more accessible and affordable. So yeah, it does the thing. So C definitely looks right here, but I would definitely check on D just to make sure, because again, we're looking for the best choice. So if D is a little bit better than C, even though C is strong, we'd have to go for D. D, many technical innovations, including the invention of photography, occurred in the 19th century. Okay, same problem as for A and B. No mention of George Eastman at all here, so D would have to be wrong. So you're probably noticing what's really happening in a lot of these questions. It's like if they omit one really important detail, or if they focus on the wrong detail, that's typically enough to eliminate or just not really go for an answer choice. So keep that in mind as you're looking through these ones. It may be a little bit hard to wrap your head around it at first, but you're just trying to see, does it include all the things the question was asking for? If yes, it's probably the right answer. If no, probably eliminate it. Let's try this one. This one's gonna be a little bit harder, so pause the video, see if you can solve it, and then we'll go to it. So the student wants to explain how the QGIS project funds its software development. So think about what this is really saying. You may not really think about this much because you're probably a student who doesn't really think about funding stuff that often, I'll say, but basically, it's saying here, how does QGIS get money for its software development? So there are many different ways you could get money here. I guess you could, steal it, but they're probably not going to be doing that. It's probably going to be something in terms of how they're getting money from people. Maybe they provide some service and they get money from it. Maybe they get some kind of loan out. I don't know. So something in terms of how they're getting money. Then we look at the choices. Because QGIS is free to download on multiple operating systems, the project relies on sales of add-on plugins to support its core developers. Okay, so this actually does look fairly strong, like sales of add-on plugins. So that's essentially saying how they might be getting stuff for the core developers, like sales that gives us money, etc. So that could definitely work. B, core QGIS development is coordinated by QGIS.org, a nonprofit association that funds the work through sustaining memberships and donations. Okay, so that also looks pretty good as well. So A and B both pretty strong so far. C, started in 2002 by Gary Sherman, QGIS now runs on Windows, macOS, and Linux and offers more than 800 community-developed plugins. That does not mention anything about how they're getting money for their stuff. It just says what they do, so I would not say that's a good answer. QGIS is a free and open source program with hundreds of plugins created by volunteers, and its core development is coordinated by QGIS.org. So, okay, it says here that it is created by volunteers. So not really anything about money here. It says it's a free and open source thing. So it doesn't really mention anything about how they're getting money in choice D. So definitely doesn't seem good as well. So between A and B here, and this is really a point where there was nothing separating A versus B. I look at A, it seems pretty strong. I look at B, it looks pretty strong as well. And there's not like any kind of big brain thing I can really look at here. Because like typically it's just going to be, if they're close together, probably they're both strong answer choices. So the way to separate them at this point is typically you're going to now do step 3, which is look at the notes and see if there's some kind of problem with one of them. A really big thing that often happens is that they actually might use incorrect information in one of the choices. So they might actually be saying something in here that's actually just not correct. So you have to check the notes to understand this better. As for reading the notes, I would say while you can, and while it's probably the best idea to read them very carefully and try to really understand them, in actuality, you more just kind of need to skim them and see which one just answers the question you're looking for. If it's something really complicated, then yes, do actually read it more carefully, but this is the one time I'm going to give you the actual freedom to, skim over something, not really read it that carefully. This was the one time, so I guess use it. QGIS is a free and open source thing. Okay, so it began in 2002. Yeah, it runs on Windows. Okay, the software has a plugin ecosystem more than 800. Okay, same thing here. Is coordinated by QGIS. Okay, we have one more note. Hopefully this is the note that gives us the right answer. So it funds development through sustaining memberships and donations. Okay, so that is the two things we're looking for. We look at this here. So the relies on sales of add-on plugins. Okay, that is not what it says. Nothing in here talks about add-on plugins. Yeah, they don't even use that word. I mean, yeah, they say 800 community developed plugins, but that's not how they're getting money for their thing. We're looking for how they're getting money for their operations. So sales of add-on plugins, not it. So we're going to have to go for B because it says here staying memberships and donations. That's exactly right. So yes, B would be the right answer here. As a reminder, only do step 3 when it really is feeling complicated. But I will say this is something that they're bringing on more and more SATs, like the May SAT, the March SAT, both of them, I'm pretty sure from what I remember, had questions on it that had you look at the notes for at least one question. So, definitely be okay with doing this. It's not going to be some kind of niche thing. It probably will show up on your next SAT. So just be okay with it, but don't be doing it for every single question. Now, I just want to give you one really hard final challenge to end this video off. Pause the video and see if you can figure out this one. I'll be honest, this one is like a very hard problem, so it may be a little bit difficult to figure out. You may get it wrong for this one, but give it your best shot. Okay, so the student wants to explain that y'all helps solve an ambiguity created by you in standard written English and to briefly note where y'all originates. So they're trying to say why y'all is useful, why it solves an issue in English, and also we want to explain where y'all came from, which will probably be the Southern United States, just based off of my own personal experience. So 2, let's see which one does these things, which one explains the problem that it solves and also where it came from. So you can be, in standard written English, can be singular or plural, but y'all from the Southern United States. Okay, that does the second part, it says where it's from. Signals a clear second person plural, reducing ambiguity. Okay, so also, yeah, reducing ambiguity. So A seems pretty solid so far. In standard written English, you can be singular or plural. In the Southern United States, speakers developed y'all and sometimes all y'all to address groups more emphatically. So there's a couple problems here. First of all, it mentions all y'all. And I know this may be like a niche thing based off what this passage is saying, but it only asks here about y'all. It just really wants to focus on y'all and where that originated from. So first of all, it's kind of like an unnecessary piece of information. Second thing, it doesn't really mention the ambiguity here. It says we're trying to find a place where it solves an ambiguity. It just says why it was useful. It doesn't actually explain where there was an ambiguity being solved. We need to be looking for something where it was super unclear and then y'all just made it fixed, made it better essentially. So I could theoretically keep this in, but I think I actually will just kind of remove it because if anything, A is definitely better than B. So I mean, if I'm between A and B, I'm definitely going to go for A. So I might as well just get rid of it automatically. Because you can refer to one person or many in standard written English, many dialects use y'all as a distinct second person plural pronoun to make group address clearer. Can you identify the wrong part about this? Well, probably the easiest thing you can say is that it doesn't say anything about where y'all came from. It doesn't mention the Southern United States or anything, so that would be wrong for that reason. Finally, we're down to D. Linguists say distinct second person plural can reduce ambiguity. Okay, so reduce ambiguity, we have that there. Y'all, which originated in Southern United States, serves that purpose and is sometimes expanded to all y'all. So this is really tricky at this point. I probably will look at the notes now. So we look at the notes, in standard written English, you can refer to either one person or more than one person. Y'all is a second person plural pronoun. Linguists note that having a distinct second person plural form can reduce ambiguity. It originates in Southern United States and they use, so really, I'm not seeing anything in the notes either for this one to help me distinguish between them because both of these do mention correct information. They're both right. So the United States, it says they can have reduced ambiguity, all these things. But I would definitely go for A over B here for 2 reasons. First of all, the all y'all thing is kind of important because it really does only mention y'all here. This one also mentions all y'all. Second important thing though is this really important detail they list here. It says it's an ambiguity created by you in standard written English. D does not mention the word you at all. It just says it can reduce ambiguity. So we need to specifically tie it back to the word you for it to be the right answer. So D would also be wrong for that reason. So I think hopefully what you can see from this video is that there's a bunch of different situations that can appear for these student notes questions. But ultimately, the most important thing you have to understand is that this can only come from actual practice. After you get the strategy down, you just have to use it a bunch of times and really see these kinds of different examples that can show up. There's nothing I can really explain in this video that's going to get you perfect on these questions, to be honest. However, it is genuinely important to get really good on these questions because I've talked to many students before in my programs who were really good at everything else in reading and writing, but just struggled a bit in student notes questions, and they actually sometimes lost points, or at least we think it was from the student notes. They lost points on real SATs. So don't let that be you. You don't want to have a perfect reading and writing module and just lose some points on student notes in the end and end up getting like a 750 when you could have been getting an 800. That'd be really bad. You'd hate if that happened. So make sure to actually understand these questions and be able to get good at the strategy. So one more thing, I'm just going to be honest with you. It really does not matter how well you understand this stuff if you don't know how to actually apply it when you get to the test day. If you don't know the strategy behind stuff like how to master timing, how to master the order that you should be doing the questions in, how to do this other stuff, how to know when to skip a question, all of that. And so if you want a bit more of that, I actually have this bonus video essentially available right in here, which is my SAT community mission 1400 plus. In this, you get a ton of really awesome resources, including that video, my entire thing, the SAT execution system, which gives you all of the insight you need for how to actually approach strategy on the test, plus a bunch of other really good features like the 14-day SAT rescue plan, which is a full guide on what you should be doing the last 2 weeks before your SAT, and a bunch of other great resources like one-on-one tutoring with me, one-on-one support where we can get any of your questions answered, and a full course on the math section as well. If you want this, check the link in the description below. I would be glad to see you all in there and help you improve your SAT score even more. But I hope this video genuinely was able to help you a lot. Hopefully this actually gave you a very good guide of everything in reading and writing, and let me know if it actually does end up improving your score. I will see you guys in the next one, and make sure to always stay Gucci.